Hello, Night Seekers. Welcome to Black Screen Horror. Close your eyes, listen to the rain, and let tonight's true, scary stories begin. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. I grew up in a house on Long Island, in a quiet little town called Brentwood. It wasn't a place people talked about much. No big crime, no strange headlines, just rows of houses with green lawns and a kind of stillness that made it feel safe. That's what my parents thought too when they bought the place. They wanted something calm, something normal, somewhere I could grow up without worry. For a while, it seemed like they had found exactly that. But normal didn't last long in that house, and by the time we understood what we had moved into, it was already too late to just walk away. My dad worked nights as a taxi driver. He would leave in the evening, drive strangers around the city and the outer parts of Long Island until the early hours of the morning, and come home right around sunrise. That was our routine. I would wake up early, plant myself in front of the television with a bowl of cereal, and wait for the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. The second I heard the engine cut off, I would run to the door. It was our little ritual. He would walk in tired, smelling like the inside of his cab, and I would ask him what kind of weird people he picked up that night. He always had a story. Drunk guys who tried to pay him in loose change, a woman who cried the entire ride and never explained why, a man who swore he saw someone standing in the middle of the road who wasn't actually there. Normal taxi driver stuff, or so I thought back then. One particular Saturday started just like any other morning. I was sitting on the carpet in my pajamas, the television glowing with cartoons, half a bowl of soggy cereal next to me. I heard the car outside, the door open, and my dad's tired footsteps come through the front hallway. I jumped up and ran over the way I always did, excited to see him, even though I saw him practically every single day. He smiled at me, ruffled my hair, and started to take off his jacket. Then a voice came from down the hallway, from the direction of my parents' bedroom. It was soft, kind of sleepy sounding, but clear enough for both of us to hear every word. "Hello, honey, don't go in the pool, it's not ready yet." My dad and I both looked at each other. It was such a strange thing to hear at 6 in the morning. We weren't anywhere near the pool. We weren't even thinking about the pool. The whole comment came out of nowhere, like someone had been watching us through a window and decided to say something just to say it. Still, at that age, and at that hour, my brain didn't spend much time on it. I remember my dad kind of laughing under his breath and saying something like, "Well, that's random," before going back to unlacing his shoes. We brushed it off. He started telling me about the night he had. Some man who kept insisting he needed to be driven to an address that didn't exist, going on with all the little details he always gave me. I sat there listening, half paying attention to him and half paying attention to my cartoons, the way kids do. It wasn't until a few minutes later that something clicked in my head. Today was Saturday. My mom worked Saturdays. She always left early, before I even woke up, and didn't come home until the afternoon. I turned to my dad and asked him, "Wait, isn't Mom at work?" He paused for a second, like he was doing the math in his head too. Then his face changed, just slightly, that look adults get when something small suddenly doesn't add up the way it should. He got up and walked down the hallway to check the bedroom. I followed behind him, my little bare feet slapping against the wood floor. The room was empty. The bed was still made from the night before. Her side of the closet was missing the coat she always wore to her job. There was no sign that anyone but us had been in that house that morning. We stood there for a moment, just the two of us, in a house that was supposed to be empty except for us, And we both had heard a voice. Not a vague noise, not something you could explain away as the pipes or the wind. A full sentence, spoken clearly, in a voice that sounded exactly like my mother's. My dad checked every room after that. The bathroom, the guest room, even the small closet under the stairs. Nothing. No open windows, no signs that anyone had come in or left. Eventually, he just shrugged it off in front of me, told me maybe I imagined it, maybe the television was playing something and I misheard it over the cartoons. But I remember the way he kept glancing back down the hallway for the rest of that morning, like he wasn't fully convinced by his own explanation. I wasn't either, but I was young enough that I let it go pretty quickly. Kids move on fast. By the afternoon, I had forgotten about it entirely, at least on the surface. We had only been living in that house a short while at that point. It was still full of unpacked boxes in the garage, still had that new house smell that hadn't quite worn off yet. Still had blank walls waiting for pictures we hadn't hung up. Everything about the place still felt unfamiliar, which I think is part of why that strange morning didn't scare me the way it probably should have. When you're a kid in a new house, everything feels a little different and unknown anyway. A stray voice, an odd creak in the floor, none of it seemed abnormal yet. We hadn't lived there long enough to know what wasn't supposed to happen. Not long after that, our new neighbors came by to introduce themselves. This was still early on, when people in the neighborhood were slowly finding out that a new family had moved into the house on the corner, and a group of them decided to come over together, the way neighbors sometimes do in small towns like that. It was two mothers walking up together, trailed by their kids. There were two boys, one close to my age and one a bit older, already in 10th grade, tall and a little too cool to want to be there. And there were two little girls. One had blonde hair, bright and loud. The kind of kid who talked before you even finished saying hello to her. The other was a small brunette girl who barely said a word the entire time. She hung near the back of the group, close to her mother's leg, watching everything with these big, quiet eyes, but never really joining in on the conversation. The adults stood in the driveway, making the usual small talk, welcoming my parents to the street, asking where we moved from, telling us little things about the neighborhood, which houses had which kinds of dogs, who to avoid at the block parties, that sort of thing. Us kids, being kids, quickly got bored standing around listening to grown-up talk, so someone suggested we go play in the backyard. It didn't take much convincing. Within a few minutes, we had a rough game of soccer going in the open part of the yard, kicking an old ball around, arguing about whose team was who, the way you do when you're forming friendships in real time out of nothing but proximity and boredom. At some point during the game, I noticed the little brunette girl wasn't with us anymore. She hadn't said she was leaving. She hadn't made any noise about going anywhere at all. She had just quietly slipped away while everyone else was busy chasing the ball, and nobody but me seemed to notice she was gone. I was a curious kid, maybe too curious for my own good, and instead of just continuing the game, I decided I wanted to go find her. I left the group without really announcing it either, ducking around the side of the house, checking near the porch, circling toward the back, where our yard bordered a stretch of trees that marked the edge of the property. That patch of woods wasn't anything huge, not some deep forest, but it was thick enough and dark enough under the canopy that it definitely wasn't somewhere a bunch of little kids should have been running around unsupervised. There were roots sticking up out of the dirt, patches of thorny brush, and the ground dipped in a few spots where you could easily twist an ankle if you weren't careful. I remember my parents already warning me not to go back there alone, that it wasn't safe, that I could get hurt or lost. But I was a kid who never really listened to warnings like that, especially when curiosity got involved. I found her a little ways in, standing near a cluster of trees, humming quietly to herself, kicking at the dirt with the toe of her shoe. She looked up when she heard me approaching, and there was something about the way she looked at me that felt a little different from the other kids. Not unfriendly, just distant, like she was somewhere else in her head, even while standing right in front of me. She asked if I wanted to play tag with her, right there among the trees. I told her no, that everyone else was playing soccer back at the house, and we should go join them instead, that it would be more fun with everybody there. She didn't argue. She just kind of nodded and followed me back toward the yard without much reaction either way. When we got back to the group, I mentioned to everyone, in the innocent way kids do, that I had found her playing by herself in the woods and that she wanted to play tag. I said something along the lines of asking if we should all go play tag together with her since she asked. The reaction from everyone was immediate and strange. The soccer ball just kind of stopped rolling. The older kids exchanged glances with each other. Quick little looks that I didn't understand at the time. The blonde girl went quiet, which for her was unusual since she hadn't stopped talking the entire time she'd been in our yard. And one of the mothers, the one who I would later learn was the mother of the brunette girl, turned to look at me with an expression I still remember clearly all these years later. It wasn't confusion. It was something closer to fear, mixed with a kind of exhausted sadness, like she had been asked this exact question before and dreaded hearing it again. She looked at me and said, very calmly, almost like she had practiced the sentence 100 times in her head before ever having to say it out loud, "We only have one daughter." I didn't understand what she meant. I looked around, confused, ready to point at the little brunette girl who I had literally just walked back from the woods with, standing right there, a few feet away from all of us. But when I turned to point her out, she was gone. Not hiding behind a tree, not slipping around the side of the house, just gone, as if she had never been standing there at all. The other kids didn't seem shocked by this. They seemed used to it. In the tired way you get used to something you've seen too many times to be scared of it anymore, but never quite comfortable with either. The visit ended pretty quickly after that. The mothers exchanged a few more polite words with my parents, said their goodbyes, and gathered their kids up to head back home. My mom, once she got back from work and heard about what happened, tried asking around, tried to get some kind of explanation from the neighbors over the following days. It took some time and a lot of careful conversation before the full story finally came out. 10 years before we moved in, a different family had lived in our house. They had a young daughter, small, quiet, brown hair, around the same age I was when we moved in. According to what the neighbors eventually told my mom, the girl had drowned in the backyard pool. Nobody in the neighborhood liked to go into too much detail about exactly how it happened, whether it was a moment of not being watched closely enough, some kind of accident with the pool cover, or something else entirely. What people did agree on was that it happened fast, and that by the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was too late to change what had already happened. The girl's mother never recovered from it. From what people described, she spent the following months barely leaving the house, refusing to drain or clean the pool, as if leaving it untouched somehow kept a piece of her daughter close. Neighbors said they would sometimes see her standing at the kitchen window at strange hours, just staring out at the water. Less than a year after her daughter died, the mother passed away too, from a heart attack, alone in that same house. Some of the older neighbors, the ones who had lived on the street the longest, said the heart attack came on suddenly, out of nowhere, with no real medical warning beforehand, which only added to the unease surrounding the whole story. The house sat empty and passed through a couple of owners after that, none of whom seemed to stay very long, before eventually ending up as the one my family bought. Once we learned all of this, the strange morning with the voice in the hallway suddenly made a lot more sense, and a lot less sense at the same time. Don't go in the pool. It's not ready yet. At the time we heard it, we thought it sounded like my mother's voice giving an odd, sleepy warning. Looking back on it after learning the history of the house, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like a warning that had nothing to do with my mother at all, spoken by someone or something that had once said those exact words for real. A long time before we ever moved in, maybe as an actual mother trying to keep her actual daughter safe, only for it to fail in the worst possible way. The years that followed that first encounter were some of the strangest of my childhood. I want to be honest, it wasn't constant terror every single day. Long stretches would pass where nothing happened at all, where the house felt as normal and boring as any other house on the street, where I could almost convince myself that voice in the hallway had been some fluke, some trick of a half-asleep morning brain. But then something would happen again, always just when we had gotten comfortable enough to stop thinking about it, and it would remind us all over again that the house wasn't entirely ours. Not fully. There were nights I would wake up to the sound of small, bare feet padding across the hallway outside my bedroom door. Soft little footsteps moving at a steady pace, back and forth, like someone pacing, or like a child walking toward the bathroom in the middle of the night the way kids do. I would lay there frozen, listening, too scared to open the door and check, too scared to call out for my parents in case whatever was out there heard me and decided to come toward my room instead. Sometimes the footsteps would just fade out after a while. Other times they would stop right outside my door, and I would lay there in the dark, holding my breath, staring at the thin strip of light or shadow beneath the door, waiting to see if the handle would turn. It never did. But the waiting itself was its own kind of horror, night after night, not knowing if this would be the time it finally did. The pool became something none of us wanted to deal with directly. My parents kept it maintained because that's just what you do with a pool, chemicals, cleaning, covering it during the colder months. But nobody in the family really wanted to swim in it. Not after learning what had happened there. Still, every once in a while, usually late in the evening when the light outside had gone dim and blue, I would glance out the kitchen window and swear I saw something moving beneath the surface of the water. Just a shape, pale and small, drifting slowly from one end to the other, there for a second and gone the next time I blinked. I never told my parents about most of these sightings, not because I didn't think they'd believe me, but because saying it out loud felt like it would make it more real than I wanted it to be. The neighbor kids, once they got more comfortable around us, started opening up more about their own experiences with the little brunette girl. Apparently, she had been showing up to different kids around the neighborhood for years before we ever arrived. Always the same way. Quiet. Appearing out of nowhere near the edges of yards or in wooded patches between properties, asking politely if they wanted to play. Most of the local kids had learned, the hard way or through warnings from their parents, that saying yes to her wasn't something you wanted to do. There were a couple of stories, told in that hushed, half-joking, half-serious way kids tell scary stories to each other, about a boy a few streets over who had actually played with her once years earlier, and how strange he acted for weeks afterward, refusing to go near water, refusing to talk about what happened, until eventually his family moved away entirely. Nobody could confirm if that story was fully true or if it had gotten exaggerated over years of being retold. But it was enough to make every kid on that street give the little brunette girl a wide, careful distance whenever she showed up. My dad, being the one who worked nights and came home in those early morning hours, ended up being around for a lot of the smaller, stranger moments that happened in that house. He told me once, much later, about a morning where he came home and found the kitchen faucet running full blast, water pooling onto the floor, even though my mom swore she had turned everything off before going to bed the night before, and I had been asleep the whole time. nowhere near that room. Another time, he said he heard someone humming softly from the direction of the bathroom while he was getting ready in his own room. A simple little tune, nothing he recognized, cutting off the instant he stepped out into the hallway to check. My mom had her own stories too, ones she didn't share with me until I was much older. Old enough that she probably figured I could handle hearing them without being terrified all over again. She told me about waking up some nights to the distinct feeling of someone sitting on the edge of the bed, a small weight pressing down into the mattress near her feet, gone the moment she fully opened her eyes and sat up to look. She told me about finding small, damp footprints on the tile floor of the bathroom some mornings, leading from nowhere to nowhere, drying up before she could even get my dad to come look at them. The pool remained the center of most of it, though it was like whatever lingered in that house was tied to the water in some way that never fully let go. There were nights the pool light would turn on by itself, glowing up from beneath the surface, even though the switch for it was inside a locked utility closet that none of us had touched. There were mornings we would come outside to find the pool cover pulled back partway, folded over on itself in a way that made no sense, as if someone small had been trying and failing to pull it fully open on their own. As the years went on, we slowly adjusted to living alongside whatever it was that shared that house with us. I wouldn't say we ever got used to it in the way you get used to background noise, but we learned to coexist with it, the way people sometimes do with things they can't explain and can't get rid of either. My parents talked more than once about moving, about finding somewhere else, somewhere with a clean, uneventful history, but every time the conversation came up, something practical always got in the way. Money, my dad's job, my school, the comfort of a routine we had already built, even a strange kind of house that came with it. In the end, we stayed in that house for 5 or 6 more years after that first strange morning. Through all of it, through every odd sound and every glimpse of something small and pale near the pool, before we finally moved on for entirely unrelated reasons. I think about that house a lot, even now, long after we left it behind. I think about that little brunette girl standing quietly in the woods, asking me to play tag like it was the most normal request in the world. I think about her mother, standing in our driveway all those years ago, saying we only have one daughter in a voice that carried the weight of 10 years of grief packed into 6 words. I think about that early Saturday morning, my dad's tired smile, the cartoon still playing behind me, and that soft, familiar sounding voice drifting down the hallway, warning us not to go in a pool that, in some way none of us fully understood at the time, was never really finished being unsafe at all. There's one more memory that has always stuck with me more than the others. Maybe because it was the closest I ever came to actually seeing her clearly, rather than just catching a shape out of the corner of my eye or hearing something move where nothing should have been moving. It happened during the second winter we lived in that house, on a night when snow had been falling steadily since the afternoon, thick enough that school had already been canceled for the next day. I remember being excited about that, lying in bed, unable to sleep, thinking about sledding and snow days instead of anything frightening at all. The house was quiet, in that heavy, muffled way houses get when snow piles up outside and swallows every sound from the street. I got up sometime past midnight to get a glass of water, the way kids do when they can't fall asleep and need some excuse to wander the house for a few minutes. The hallway light was off, but the snow outside reflected enough pale light through the windows that I didn't need to turn anything on to see where I was going. As I passed the window near the top of the stairs, the one that looked out over the backyard and the pool, I stopped without really meaning to. Something outside had caught my eye. The pool cover was on, the way it always was during the colder months, a heavy tarp stretched across the water and weighed down at the edges. Snow had gathered on top of it in a smooth, even layer, untouched the way fresh snow looks before anyone or anything has walked across it. Except right in the middle of the cover, there was a small, clear shape pressed down into the snow. Not footprints leading up to it, not a trail crossing the yard from the house or the woods, just the shape itself, sitting there in the center of the cover, as if someone small had been standing directly in that one spot without ever having walked to get there. I stood at that window longer than I probably should have, staring down at it, my glass of water forgotten in my hand. I kept waiting for the shape to move, or for me to convince myself it was just some odd trick of the wind piling snow unevenly, but it never did move, and the harder I looked, the more it looked exactly like the outline of two small feet, standing close together, facing the house, facing the window I was standing at. I don't remember deciding to walk away from that window, only that at some point I was already back in my bed with the blankets pulled up, wide awake, listening to the silence of the snow outside and trying not to think about what I had just seen. I never went back to check in the morning. By the time the sun came up, fresh snow had continued falling through the early hours, covering over whatever had been there the night before, smoothing the pool cover back into an unbroken white sheet like nothing had ever stood on it at all. I didn't tell my parents about it until years later, long after we had moved out of that house for good, and even then I could only half explain it. The way you try to describe a dream that felt more real than it should have. My dad just nodded slowly when I told him, like he had his own version of a story just like it, that he had never gotten around to sharing either. That house gave us plenty more stories than the ones I've shared here. Small moments, strange nights, encounters that never fully added up, no matter how many times we talked them over as a family. And images like that one at the window that I've never been able to fully shake, even now, all these years later. If people want to hear more, there's plenty left to tell. My mother-in-law was one of those people everyone genuinely loved being around. Funny in a sharp, quick-witted way that could catch you off guard in the middle of an ordinary conversation and have the whole room laughing before you even realized what she'd said. She and my wife were incredibly close, closer than most mothers and daughters manage to be. The kind of relationship built on years of inside jokes and long phone calls, and a bond that never seemed to waver no matter what life threw at either of them. So when she passed away, it hit my wife in a way that changed her fundamentally. A grief so deep it took years to even begin settling into something manageable. The kind of loss that reshapes a person quietly from the inside, even as they keep going through the motions of ordinary life on the outside. Our son had only just turned 4 months old when she died, which meant he never got the chance to know her at all. Not really. Nothing beyond the handful of photographs we kept around the house and the stories my wife would tell him as he got older, trying to keep some version of her alive for him, even though he'd never once heard her actual voice or felt her arms around him. We lived, and still live, in an old craftsman house, here in Pasadena, built sometime back in the 1930s. The kind of home with genuine character, deep windowsills, original hardwood floors that creak in specific, familiar spots. A layout that feels intimate and slightly maze-like compared to the newer builds you see going up everywhere else in the area now. There's a small built-in nook off the dining room where the original owners apparently used to keep a phone table, a narrow staircase with a landing that turns at an odd angle, and a bathroom upstairs with the original clawfoot tub still intact. The kind of details that made us fall in love with the place the moment our realtor first walked us through it. We loved that house for exactly those reasons. The history built into its bones, the sense that generations of families had already lived and grown old within those same walls before we ever arrived, raised their own children in those same narrow hallways, bathed their own babies in that same tub. It never occurred to either of us, not once, to wonder what else might have lingered in a house that old. What echoes might have settled into the wood and plaster over 90 years of lives lived inside it. Flash forward a few years from my mother-in-law's passing to when our son was about 3 years old. And that's when things started happening that I still don't have a clean explanation for. No matter how many times I've turned the whole thing over in my head since. It was an ordinary evening, nothing special about it, and I was giving him his bath the way I did most nights, kneeling beside the old clawfoot tub that had come with the house, sleeves rolled up, half paying attention to him splashing around while my mind wandered through whatever mundane thoughts fill up a parent's head during bath time. At some point, I noticed he'd gone quiet. And when I looked over, he wasn't looking at his toys or at me. He was looking past me, over my shoulder, toward the doorway of the bathroom, his eyes fixed on something with the particular focused attention kids get when they're actually watching something, rather than just staring off into space the way toddlers sometimes do. I didn't think much of it at first. Kids get distracted by all kinds of things, shadows, reflections, the play of light through a window, the way the steam from the bath water sometimes caught the light from the overhead fixture and drifted in slow, lazy patterns near the ceiling. But this felt different somehow, sustained in a way idle distraction usually isn't. His eyes tracking something with a kind of continuity that made the back of my neck prickle even before I understood why. His little face doing that thing kids do when they're actually engaged with something. Eyebrows drawing together slightly, head tilting just a fraction to one side. A moment passed like that, him staring past me. And then, in this completely casual, matter-of-fact tone that kids use when they're asking you something they assume you already know the answer to, he asked me why Grandma calls Mommy a funny name. I froze for a second, caught off guard by the question itself, and I asked him what he meant, assuming at first he must be talking about my own mother, who he did know and see regularly, wondering if she had some pet name for my wife that I'd simply never picked up on before. He looked at me like I was being a little slow, the way small children sometimes look at adults who aren't keeping up, and he said it again. Except this time, he actually said the name. He used the specific nickname, the one that had belonged entirely and only to my mother-in-law. A private little pet name she had called my wife for as long as my wife could remember, going all the way back to infancy according to family stories. Something so personal and specific that my wife and I had genuinely never once used it ourselves in front of him. Not casually, not in a story, not anywhere he could plausibly have overheard it from either of us. I sat there for a moment, water dripping off my hands where they'd stilled against the edge of the tub, trying to process what I'd just heard, trying to come up with any reasonable explanation for how a 3-year-old could possibly know a nickname that had died along with the one person who'd ever used it. A nickname he had never once heard spoken aloud in his entire life, as far as I knew. I asked him, as calmly as I could manage, even though my heart had started pounding, where he'd heard that name before. He answered without any hesitation at all, in that same easy, unbothered tone the farmer told me. I asked who the farmer was. He said, simply, his friend, and then went right back to playing with his bath toys as if we just had the most ordinary conversation in the world, completely unaware of how badly he'd just rattled me sitting there beside him. I remember trying to keep my voice light as I asked a few more questions, whether the farmer was a boy or a grown-up, whether he'd seen him before that night, whether the farmer was in the room right now. My son answered each question easily, without any of the hesitation or made-up quality kids usually have when they're inventing something on the spot, telling me the farmer was big and old and that he'd been around for a while. Phrases that felt oddly formal coming out of a 3-year-old's mouth, like he was repeating something rather than describing it in his own words. The kind of description you'd expect from someone summarizing what they'd been told rather than someone conjuring a character out of pure imagination on the spot. That night, once he was down for bed, I told my wife everything that had happened, watching her face change as I got further into the story, watching her go pale, and then, by the time I got to the actual nickname, watching her break down entirely into tears. That name had belonged only to her mother. It wasn't written down anywhere in the house, wasn't in any of the photo albums we kept out, wasn't something either of us had ever used even privately, between ourselves. There was truly no reasonable way our son could have known it. No family member who might have casually mentioned it in front of him. No story either of us had ever told him that included it. My wife sat at the kitchen table that night, with her head in her hands, asking over and over how could he possibly know that? Her mother had been gone for over 3 years by that point, and she'd never once heard anyone outside the immediate family use that name. Not her own siblings, not her father. Nobody. Not even in old letters or cards that might have been lying around the house for him to somehow have seen. We sat together that night trying to make sense of it, going through every possible explanation we could think of, and coming up with absolutely nothing that fit. Eventually, we just sort of marveled at it together. The way you do with something that feels too strange and too personal to be pure coincidence, but also too impossible to fully accept as anything more than that. We didn't talk about it again for a while after that, not because we'd forgotten, but because neither of us knew what else there was to say. The following weekend, my wife was at work. She did retail hours back then that often had her out of the house on Saturdays, and I was home since my own job kept a standard Monday through Friday schedule. Our son was in his room playing, which was normal enough, something he did for stretches at a time, content entertaining himself with whatever toys were scattered across his floor while I worked around the house or caught up on things in another room. At some point, I became aware that he was talking. Not the usual narrated play voice kids use when they're running toy cars around or having stuffed animals talk to each other, but something that sounded distinctly like an actual back-and-forth conversation. I could hear him saying things like yes and no. And then, at one point, I don't know that, followed by a small burst of laughter. The kind of genuine, delighted laugh kids give when someone's actually said something funny to them. I stood there in the hallway for a good minute or two before I actually went in, telling myself it was nothing. That plenty of kids narrate elaborate pretend conversations with toys or invisible friends, that I was letting the bathtub incident from the week before make me read too much into something perfectly ordinary. But there was a rhythm to it that unsettled me the longer I listened. Gaps of silence between his responses that felt exactly like the pauses you'd leave for someone else to actually speak, followed by him reacting to something, nodding along audibly with little verbal cues, occasionally saying, "Wait." "Really?" in a tone of genuine surprise. The kind of reaction that's hard to fake convincingly when you're only 3 years old and don't yet have much practice performing emotions you're not actually feeling. I stood in the hallway outside his door for a moment, listening, trying to figure out if maybe he'd found some way to sneak a tablet or a toy with a speaker into his room. Something that might explain the responses I was hearing woven into his side of the conversation, running through the mental list of every electronic toy he owned, and whether any of them were even capable of that kind of interaction. Nothing about it sounded like that, though. It sounded like he was actually talking with someone, pausing in all the right places, reacting the way you do when another person has just said something to you, rather than the flat, uninterrupted chatter kids produce when they're just talking to themselves or their toys. I went in and asked him what he was doing. He said, simply, playing. The way any 3-year-old would answer that question, completely unbothered. I asked who he was playing with. Without any hesitation, in that same easy tone from the bathroom the week before, he said the farmer. I'll be honest, my mind went immediately to every horror movie I'd ever watched. The Exorcist chief among them, that whole business with Captain Howdy and an imaginary friend that turned out to be something else entirely lurking behind a Ouija board. I know it sounds dramatic, and at the time I tried to talk myself down from it. Tried to remind myself that imaginary friends are an incredibly normal, well-documented part of early childhood development. That plenty of perfectly healthy kids invent entire elaborate friendships with people who don't exist. I even did a quick search on my phone later that night, sitting on the edge of our bed after my son had finally fallen asleep. Reading through article after article about imaginary companions in toddlers, reassuring myself with statistics about how common the phenomenon actually is, how psychologists generally consider it a healthy, normal part of cognitive development rather than anything to worry about. But something about the specificity of it, the fact that this imaginary friend had a name, a title even, the farmer, rather than the vague, shapeless companions most toddlers dream up, sat uneasily with me in a way I couldn't quite shake. Most of the examples I read about involved kids inventing friends with ordinary names, a Timmy or a Sarah, or sometimes just an animal, a rabbit or a dog they talked to. None of the articles mentioned anything about a title like the farmer, an occupation rather than a name, something that felt oddly specific and adult, in a way that didn't match how 3-year-olds usually name things. Kids that age tend to name their toys and imaginary friends after whatever's immediately in front of them, or after characters from shows they watch, or sometimes just nonsense syllables strung together. The farmer felt different, deliberate somehow, like it had been given to him rather than invented by him. I asked him where the farmer was right then, in that moment. He told me, matter-of-factly, that the farmer had left when I came into the room. I remember standing there in his doorway for a second, just processing that sentence, feeling a genuine chill crawl up the back of my neck, despite the fact that nothing about the room looked any different than usual. Sunlight coming in through the window the way it always did, toys scattered across the rug exactly where he'd left them. When my wife got home from work that evening, I told her everything, watching her expression shift from mild curiosity into the same unsettled look I knew had probably been on my own face earlier that afternoon while I stood there in his doorway. We sat at the kitchen table, talking it through, trying to be reasonable about it, reminding each other that imaginary friends really are common, that plenty of kids his age go through phases exactly like this. But underneath all that rational reassurance, neither of us could quite let go of the nickname incident from the week before. The fact that whatever this farmer thing was, it had apparently known something deeply private about our family that our son had absolutely no way of knowing on his own. We decided in the end that we didn't really know what to do about any of it, and that if something else happened, we'd figure it out then. It felt like a strange thing to simply wait on, but neither of us had any better idea, and calling someone about our toddler's imaginary friend felt, at the time, like an overreaction we weren't quite ready to commit to. A few days later, in the middle of the night, we both woke up at almost the exact same moment to the sound of our son's voice coming through the baby monitor, clear and calm, saying something that neither of us has ever fully been able to shake since. He said, "Grandma says, you and I can't be friends anymore." We hadn't heard any preceding conversation on the monitor. No build-up. Nothing to suggest he'd been awake and talking for a while before we caught this particular fragment of it. It was as if we'd woken specifically to hear that one sentence, delivered in a completely calm, unbothered voice, the same easy tone he used for everything else related to the farmer, with none of the fear or distress you'd expect from a child having a nightmare or waking from something frightening. That calmness was almost worse than if he'd sounded scared, because it meant whatever was happening, he didn't perceive it as threatening at all. Just another ordinary conversation happening in his room in the middle of the night. My wife and I looked at each other in the dark, both of us instantly wide awake, and we got up together and went down the hall to check on him. He was sitting upright in his bed, not crying, not distressed, just sitting there the way you might sit if you just finished a perfectly ordinary conversation, his small hands resting loosely in his lap, his eyes adjusted enough to the darkness that he looked directly at us as we came through the door rather than blinking against sudden light the way kids usually do when woken up. I asked him if he was okay. He said yes, and then, without any prompting, he added that Grandma had told him he couldn't play with the farmer anymore. We stood there in his doorway for a long moment, the two of us, not entirely sure what to say or do, watching our 3-year-old settle himself back down under his blankets like nothing unusual had happened at all. Completely at ease, none of the lingering, unsettled energy either of us was still very much feeling ourselves standing there in the dark. Eventually, we tucked him back in, checked that his nightlight was still working the way it always had, and went back to our own room, lying awake for a long while afterward without saying much, both of us processing in our own way what we'd just heard. He never mentioned the farmer again. Not once. Not that night. Not the next week. Not ever. In all the years since. It simply stopped. As abruptly and completely as it had started. No gradual fading out the way imaginary friends sometimes do. Just a clean, total end the very same night that sentence came through the monitor. We kept a closer eye on him for a while after that, watching for any sign it might come back. Any hint of another conversation happening behind a closed door. But there was nothing. Life went back to normal, or at least what passed for normal, in a house where something like that had just happened. In the weeks that followed, my wife found herself spending more time than usual sitting with the old photo albums, the ones with pictures of her mother from before we'd even met, flipping through them slowly some evenings after our son had gone to bed, looking at that familiar smiling face and wondering, the way you do with grief that never fully closes, what exactly had happened in that house while she was at work. She never said it outright, but I could tell some part of her found comfort in the idea that her mother had somehow still been watching over our son, still finding ways to look after him even from wherever she'd gone. Another part of her, the more practical part, worried constantly that we'd missed something important, some sign we should have acted on sooner, though what exactly we could have done differently, neither of us ever managed to figure out. We debated, more than once during that stretch, whether we should talk to someone about it, a therapist, a priest, anyone who might have some kind of framework for understanding what had happened. In the end, we never did, partly because the whole thing had resolved itself so cleanly, and partly because neither of us really knew how to explain it to someone else without sounding like we'd lost our minds. It felt like the kind of story that only made sense from the inside, something you had to have actually lived through to take seriously. And the idea of trying to convince a stranger that our toddler's imaginary friend had apparently been shut down by his deceased grandmother felt, even to us, a little too absurd to say out loud in a professional's office. He's 13 now, well into those early teenage years. Tall and a little awkward the way boys that age tend to be, completely wrapped up in school and friends and all the ordinary concerns of adolescence. He doesn't remember any of it. We've asked him about it once, carefully, years after the fact, trying to gauge whether some fragment of memory had survived somewhere in the back of his mind, and he just looked at us blankly, genuinely confused, with absolutely no recollection of a bath time conversation about a nickname, or an invisible friend who called himself the farmer, or a grandmother he never got the chance to meet, apparently stepping in to end whatever that friendship had been. He laughed it off when we told him the story, called it weird in the flat, unbothered way teenagers dismiss things that don't interest them, and then went right back to whatever he'd been doing on his phone, completely unaware of how much that particular memory still weighs on the two of us. My wife and I, though, we remember everything about it, down to the smallest details, the exact tone of his voice when he first said that nickname over my shoulder in the bathroom, the sound of his laughter drifting down the hallway while he talked to someone I couldn't see, the flat, matter-of-fact way he told us Grandma had ended things between him and the farmer. We've talked about it more times than I could count over the years, usually late at night, usually after a glass of wine or two has loosened up the kind of conversation you don't normally have, circling back to the same unanswerable questions. Who or what was the farmer? How our son could possibly have known that nickname? And whether, somewhere in that old craftsman house of ours, in a bedroom down the hall from where we sleep, his grandmother really had stepped in one night to protect her grandson from something neither of us has ever wanted to look at too closely, choosing instead to be grateful, in our own quiet way, that whatever it was, it listened to her and never came back. Sometimes, even now, when the house goes quiet late at night the way old houses do, all their settling creaks finally still, I find myself thinking about that bedroom down the hall, about a 3-year-old sitting up calmly in the dark, answering to something with a title instead of a name, and about whoever or whatever was on the other side of that conversation finally being told by someone with clearly enough authority to be obeyed without argument that it was time to leave and never come back. I don't know what the farmer actually was, and some nights I'm genuinely grateful I never found out. But I know my mother-in-law in every way I ever knew her while she was alive. And I know that if there was ever a version of her still capable of looking out for the people she loved from wherever she'd gone, she would have done exactly what our son described, walked into that room, put a stop to whatever was happening, and made absolutely certain it never happened again. I was 5, maybe 6 years old, when I came down with a cold that would change the way I understand fear for the rest of my life. It was a weekend, which meant my mother was gone. She worked part-time at the local hospital back then, pulling shifts that always seemed to land on the days I wanted her most, the days when I was tired or cranky or, like that particular afternoon, simply unwell. So it was just me, my father, and my older brother in the house, the 3 of us rattling around in a home that suddenly felt too big and too quiet without her presence to fill it. I remember the house had a particular smell in the summer. Sun-warmed wood and the faint chlorine tang of the pool filter running out back. And even now, all these years later, certain smells can drag me right back to that afternoon without warning. My brother was older than me by a few years, old enough that he mostly ignored me on weekends unless our mother made him keep an eye on me, and that day he'd been given exactly that job, though I doubt either of us thought much of it. He was sprawled on the couch, with the television turned low, and every so often I'd hear him laugh at something on screen, a small, ordinary sound that made the rest of the house feel safe simply by existing. My father moved between the kitchen and the living room, doing the kind of quiet chores fathers do on a Saturday, dishes and laundry, and the low hum of the radio he liked to keep on while he worked. None of it felt like the start of anything. It felt like the most ordinary afternoon imaginable, the kind you forget the moment it's over, except that this one refused to be forgotten. I don't remember running a fever. I want to be clear about that, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. Over the years, I've told myself that I must have been burning up, that my small body must have been fighting something serious beneath the surface, because that is the only explanation that lets me sleep at night without my mind wandering somewhere darker. But in the moment, lying in my bed in the middle of a bright summer day, I didn't feel hot. I felt tired and stuffy and a little sorry for myself, the way any child feels when a cold keeps them from going outside to play with the other kids on the street, whose voices I could still hear faintly drifting in through my open window, laughing and shouting over some game I was missing out on. My father sent me to my room to rest, tucked the blanket up to my chin the way he always did, smoothing it flat with his palm, and told me to close my eyes and sleep it off. I remember thinking it was unfair. I remember being annoyed that my brother got to stay up and watch television while I had to lie there in the middle of the afternoon, eyes shut, willing myself towards sleep that simply refused to come. The windows in my room were open. It was summer, after all, and our house didn't have central air conditioning back then, so my parents left the windows cracked during the day to let in whatever breeze the afternoon offered, closing them again once the evening turned cool. I lay there for a long while, maybe 20 minutes, maybe longer, time moving in that strange elastic way it does for a sick child stuck in bed with nothing to do but wait for sleep or boredom to finally win out. I kept my eyes shut tight, the way you do when you're trying to force rest onto yourself, when you think that if you just want it badly enough, your body will eventually give in and let you drift away. It never really works that way, not for adults and certainly not for children, but I tried anyway, counting my own breaths the way my mother had once shown me, in through the nose, out through the mouth, slow and steady. Then I felt it, a breeze, light and cool, moving across my face. At first, it meant absolutely nothing to me. The window was open, the day was warm outside, a breeze drifting through the room was the most natural thing in the world. Nothing worth opening my eyes over. I didn't even think about it consciously, not at first, except that something about it felt strange the longer it continued, how it didn't rise and fall the way wind usually does, gusting and then dying away in that familiar rhythm outdoor air always follows. This particular current of air just stayed there, constant, unchanging, brushing steadily over my cheeks and forehead like something enormous breathing very slowly and very close to my face, patient in a way that natural wind never is. That unnatural steadiness is what finally made me open my eyes. I don't know what I expected to see when I did. Maybe the curtains stirring against the frame, maybe nothing at all, just the ordinary ceiling of my childhood bedroom with its little glow in the dark stars stuck up near the light fixture. What I saw instead were faces. Above my bed, hanging in the space where there should have been nothing but empty air and the shifting shadows the afternoon sun cast against the plaster, were shapes I can still draw from memory if someone handed me a pencil right now, even after all these decades. They were hooded, some kind of fabric or covering pulled up tight around what should have been the crowns of their heads, and they had no bodies beneath them at all. Nothing whatsoever. Just heads and shoulders and the barest hint of a neck fading into nothing, the way an old photograph blurs and disappears at its edges. They hung there, motionless at first, simply floating above me the way a balloon hovers when the air in a closed room has gone completely still. I could see their faces clearly, and that is the part I wish, more than anything else, I could somehow unremember. The skin, where I could make it out beneath the shadow cast by their hoods, was red and raw, the kind of angry red that human skin turns after a bad burn, fleshy in a way that made my small stomach lurch, even though I was far too young to fully grasp what I was looking at, or why it filled me with such immediate, bone-deep revulsion. It wasn't smooth the way skin should be. It had a wrongness woven into its very texture, catching the afternoon light strangely, glistening wetly in places where nothing should have been glistening at all. And beneath that ruined, damaged-looking skin, their mouths were curled upward into smiles. Not friendly ones. Not the kind of smile a parent gives a sleepy child, or a sibling gives when they've won a game. These smiles were dark, stretched impossibly wide across faces that shouldn't have been able to stretch that far. The corners pulling upward in a way that had nothing whatsoever to do with joy, and everything to do with something I simply didn't have a word for yet at that age. Something my child's mind couldn't categorize except as pure, immediate wrongness. For a moment, I simply stared, unable to move or speak or even properly breathe. Children freeze sometimes, the same way small animals do when confronted with a predator, and I think that first suspended breath after seeing them clearly was pure paralysis. My whole small body trying desperately to catch up with what my eyes were insisting was real and happening right there above me. And then, almost as one, they began to laugh. It wasn't loud. That's what makes it worse in my memory even now, the fact that it never once grew loud. Not really. Not the way you'd expect something so horrifying to sound. It was a low noise, wet, somehow, thick, coming from all three of them at the exact same moment, but not quite in unison. Overlapping just enough at the edges to feel deeply unnatural, like a recording of laughter playing back slightly out of sync with itself, each voice trailing a fraction of a second behind the last. And as they laughed, low and wet and endless, they began to move. Not floating in place any longer, but circling, slowly, deliberately, drifting around one another above my bed, orbiting some invisible point directly over my chest as though they were tethered to my own small, terrified heartbeat. Their laughter rising and falling in volume as they turned, closer and then farther, closer and then farther again. I remember slapping both hands over my ears as hard as I could. I remember squeezing my eyes shut so tightly that bright colors burst behind my eyelids, the way they do when you press too hard against them, hoping desperately that if I couldn't see them and couldn't hear them, they would simply cease to exist entirely, the way monsters are supposed to vanish once you refuse to look at them anymore. But shutting my eyes did absolutely nothing to help. I could still feel their presence there, above me. Still feel that steady, unnatural breeze that I now understood, with a child's sudden, terrible clarity, wasn't coming from the window at all, and never had been. I could still hear that low, wet laughter bleeding through, even with my palms pressed hard enough against my ears to hurt. I started to cry then, and not the ordinary crying of a scraped knee or a scolding. I remember the tears more clearly than almost anything else from that entire day. Hot and fast and endless. The kind of crying that comes from a fear far too enormous for a small body to properly hold or process. I screamed for my father. I don't know how many times I called out for him before he actually came running. It felt like an eternity stretched out impossibly long, though I'm certain now it could only have been seconds. His heavy footsteps pounding down the hallway outside my door, his voice already calling back to me even before he reached it, asking what was wrong, telling me he was coming, telling me to hold on. When he finally burst through the door and gathered me up into his arms, lifting me clean off the mattress, I was still screaming, still sobbing uncontrollably, my whole small body shaking hard against his chest. He held me tight against him and told me over and over that it was just a dream, that I must have fallen asleep and scared myself with a nightmare, that everything was fine now, that he was right there and nothing could hurt me anymore. But I hadn't been asleep. I want that understood clearly, even now, even knowing exactly how impossible and unbelievable it sounds decades later. I had been wide awake the entire time, eyes open, staring directly up at those hooded shapes as they circled slowly above me. And the moment my father burst into that room, the moment the door swung open and light from the hallway spilled across the ceiling, they were simply gone. Vanished completely, the way smoke disperses the instant a window is thrown open, no trace left behind anywhere except the cold feeling still crawling slowly over my skin, and the strange ringing silence pressing against my ears where their laughter had been only seconds before. What happened after that moment is where my memory becomes genuinely strange, fractured in a way that unsettles me far more, if I'm honest, than the hooded figures themselves ever managed to. There is a gap in my recollection, a stretch of time I simply do not have any access to whatsoever, no matter how hard I strain to reach back into it, no matter how many quiet nights I've spent as an adult lying awake trying to force those missing memories back up to the surface the way I once tried so hard to force myself to sleep. I don't know how long that gap lasted. I don't know what happened during those missing hours. My mind, for whatever protective reason, apparently chose to close a door somewhere in that stretch of time and has never once let me back through it, no matter how many times over the years I've tried. But there is one more fragment that survived that gap intact. One single image that has never faded, no matter how much time has passed since. No matter how many other childhood memories have blurred and softened and eventually disappeared entirely the way memories do. I remember being in the back of my father's car, not sitting properly in a seat the way a child is supposed to be, buckled in safely, but down low in the space between the seats, the floor well behind the front row, folded into myself with my knees pulled tight against my chest and both arms wrapped around my own head, hands still pressed hard over my ears, in exactly the same way they had been back in my bedroom. My mother was there too, somehow, though I don't remember her arriving home from her shift, don't remember when or how she came to be sitting behind my father with her legs stretched out on either side of my small curled body, her whole frame bent protectively around mine like she was trying, with everything she had, to shield me from something she herself couldn't see, but somehow understood, with a mother's certainty, was every bit as real as I insisted it was. And I was screaming. I remember that with total clarity even now, the rawness already building in my own small throat, the words tearing out of me over and over without pause. They were back. They wouldn't leave me alone. They wanted me dead. I don't know what I must have looked like in that moment. Curled and shaking and screaming on the floor of a moving car, don't know what my parents were seeing as they watched their small child shrieking about hooded things that wanted her dead, but I know now, as a parent myself, that it must have terrified them both in a way that has genuinely never fully left either one of them, even now, even though none of us ever really talk about that day anymore. Not directly, not in any detail. We were driving to the hospital. I know that much for certain, pieced together slowly over the years, from things overheard as a teenager, from fragments my parents let slip on rare occasions when they thought I wasn't listening closely enough to understand what they were actually discussing. Beyond that single fact, I have nothing more. The memory simply ends there, suspended in the back of that car, my mother's legs braced on either side of me and my own voice breaking apart mid-scream as I begged whatever it was to finally leave me alone. What happened once we arrived at the hospital? How long I stayed there? What any doctor or nurse said or did? What tests were run? Or what my parents were told? All of it is entirely gone from me. Swallowed whole by whatever protective mechanism in a frightened child's mind decides certain things are simply too much to carry forward into adulthood. I've tried more than once as an adult to find some kind of record of that day. I asked my mother once, as gently as I could manage, whether there might still be paperwork somewhere, some old file from that hospital visit that could finally tell me what a doctor actually observed, what words they used, whether anyone had written down a temperature or a diagnosis, or even just a passing note about a frightened little girl who wouldn't stop screaming about hooded things that wanted her dead. She told me she doubted anything like that would still exist after so many years, and something in the way she said it, a little too quickly, a little too smoothly, made me let the subject drop before I'd really begun to push. I've wondered since whether that was simply the truth, records lost the way records always seem to be after enough time passes, or whether it was easier for her to say that than to sit down with me and actually go looking for something neither of us was entirely sure we wanted found. My brother, for his part, remembers almost nothing from that day, or claims he doesn't. When I've brought it up over the years, usually late at night after a few drinks, when old memories tend to surface more easily, he goes quiet in a way that isn't like him, and then changes the subject with a kind of practiced ease that makes me suspect he remembers more than he's willing to say. Once, only once, he admitted that he remembered standing in the hallway outside my room that afternoon, close enough to hear me screaming, and that our father had told him to stay back, to stay in the living room, in a voice our father almost never used. He said he remembered being frightened, not by anything he saw, because he says he saw nothing, but by the sound of our father's voice giving that instruction, flat and urgent, in a way that told him, even as a child, that whatever was happening in that bedroom was not an ordinary tantrum or an ordinary nightmare. I've told myself for years, decades now, really, that it must have been the fever. That's the explanation I offer whenever it comes up in conversation. Whenever a friend or partner asks about my strange, specific fear of silence, and I feel obligated to explain, at least partially, where it actually comes from. I say it must have been a hallucination brought on by illness, a fever dream so unusually vivid that it felt entirely real, so real that even now, all these years later, I can still describe the exact shade of angry red on those ruined faces without hesitation, can still hear the wet, overlapping edges of that laughter if I let my mind linger there too long. It's the explanation that lets me function normally, the one that quietly transforms something inexplicable and frightening into something ordinary and medical, something that happens to feverish children fairly often and means nothing more sinister than a small body working hard to fight off an infection. But I never actually had a fever, not that I remember experiencing myself. And not that anyone has ever once confirmed to me directly in all the years since. My father sent me to bed that day because I had a cold, nothing more than a stuffy nose and a scratchy throat, nothing anyone would have considered serious at the time. No one has ever mentioned my skin feeling unusually hot to the touch that afternoon. No one has ever mentioned checking a thermometer or worrying aloud about my temperature. No one has, in all the years since, ever told me outright that I was burning up when any of this happened. I've asked, carefully in roundabout indirect ways over the years, trying hard not to reveal exactly how much the answer actually matters to me. The responses I get back are always vague, always uncertain. My own parents' memories clearly just as fractured and incomplete as mine whenever it comes to that particular day, as though something scrubbed all three of our recollections down to the exact same handful of surviving details, and refused to let any of us hold on to anything more than that. What I do know for absolute certain, what I carry with me quietly every single day since that afternoon, is what happens to me now whenever the world around me goes truly quiet. It doesn't take much to trigger it. Not anymore. A room where the conversation suddenly stops without warning. A house late at night, once everyone else has finally gone to sleep, and the usual small creaks and hums of daily living fall away into nothing. Even something as simple and mundane as putting in a pair of earplugs, that muffled deadness pressing in against my eardrums from the inside, can send my heart racing hard before I even consciously understand why it's happening. It isn't ordinary quiet that bothers me, to be clear. Most silence is perfectly fine, even comfortable, the kind of gentle stillness that lets a person think clearly or finally rest after a long day. What sends me spiraling instead is a very particular quality of silence, one that seems to press inward against my ears from somewhere deep inside. A silence so total and complete that it genuinely starts to hurt. The way an unbearably loud sound might hurt, except somehow inverted. The absence itself becoming the unbearable thing. I don't know how to properly describe that specific sensation to anyone who has never felt it themselves, except to say plainly that it is the exact same feeling I had lying in my childhood bed all those years ago, with my small hands pressed hard over my ears, desperately trying to block out laughter that came from things with no bodies at all and burned, ruined, red faces. It's as if some deep part of my nervous system decided, in that single terrible moment, that this precise quality of silence was the sound, or perhaps the absence of sound, that always comes right before something truly terrible happens. And no matter how many decades have passed since, no matter how many times I tell myself it was only a fever, only a bad dream, only a sick child's overactive imagination running wild in an empty afternoon bedroom, that deep part of me never once got the message. It still braces itself every single time the world around me goes still in that particular specific way. It still waits. It still listens, quietly and constantly, for the eventual return of a laughter I have spent my entire adult life trying desperately to forget, and have never once, not for a single day, actually managed to leave fully behind me. Sometimes, on the very worst nights, when I can't sleep and the house has gone that particular kind of silent, I find myself doing something I've never told anyone before, not even my own family. I lie perfectly still and I press my hands over my ears the exact same way I did as a child, testing myself, daring the silence to press back. And every single time, without fail, for just one heartbeat, I swear I feel that same cool, steady breeze brush across my face, patient and unhurried, waiting for me to open my eyes. I never do, not anymore. I keep them shut, and I count my own breaths the way I did as a child, trying to force myself to sleep, and eventually the breeze fades, or I convince myself it does, and the ordinary sounds of the house come creeping back in around the edges of the quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of a clock somewhere down the hall, the small comforting evidence that the world is still exactly as full and as noisy as it should be. I tell myself that's proof enough that nothing was ever really there, that a frightened child's fever dream simply grew roots too deep to pull out, and that the breeze is only ever my own imagination reaching back across all those years to touch me one more time. But some nights, lying there with my hands still resting near my ears just in case, I let myself wonder, only for a moment, whether somewhere above the bed, patient as ever, something red and ruined and endlessly amused is still circling, waiting for the next time the house goes quiet enough, waiting for the next time a child, or a grown woman who still remembers being one, dares to lie still and listen for far too long. A few years back, I was living alone in a small rented house at the edge of a quiet residential street. the kind of place where the streetlights were spaced too far apart, and the houses on either side of me sat dark more nights than not, their owners working late shifts or simply preferring to keep their curtains drawn. It was an older house, the kind with a narrow covered porch out front, wooden steps that creaked no matter how carefully you walked on them, a low wooden railing running along either side of the steps that always felt slightly loose under my hand whenever I gripped it, and a single overhead light fixture by the door that I almost never used because the switch was awkwardly placed just inside the entryway, tucked behind a coat rack that made it easy to forget was even there. The house had come with a small history I only half knew. Second-hand stories from the landlord about a previous tenant who'd moved out abruptly, though at the time I hadn't thought much of it. Chalking it up to the ordinary churn of renters who come and go for reasons that rarely have anything to do with the house itself. It was a weeknight. Nothing special about the date. Nothing that stood out beforehand as different from any other evening I'd spent in that house. I was sitting in the living room with the television on, half paying attention to whatever was playing, the kind of background noise you keep running more for company than for content when you live by yourself, and the silence of an empty house starts to feel a little too loud after a while. I should explain something about myself before I go further, because it matters for the rest of this story. I have never liked answering the door at night, not even before any of this happened. There's something about a doorbell ringing after dark that has always put me on edge, some old instinct left over from childhood, maybe from movies, maybe from nothing at all except the simple fact that visitors during the day are usually expected, and visitors at night usually aren't. So when I'm home alone, especially after the sun goes down, I have a routine I follow without even thinking about it anymore. I don't turn on the porch light right away. I move quietly to the door, and before I do anything else, before I even consider opening it, I look through the peephole first, letting my eyes adjust to whatever darkness is waiting on the other side. The idea, at least in my head, is that if I don't turn the light on, whoever is standing on my porch can't necessarily tell if anyone is home or not, which gives me a small advantage, a few extra seconds to decide whether I actually want to open that door at all. That night, the doorbell rang somewhere around 9 or 10 in the evening, though I couldn't tell you the exact time even if you asked. Because I wasn't watching the clock, I was watching the television, half drowsy on the couch with a blanket pulled over my legs the way you do on an ordinary night when nothing feels wrong yet. The sound cut through the low murmur of the TV and my whole body went still for a second, the way it always does when I'm not expecting anyone and a doorbell rings unannounced. I sat there for a moment, listening, half hoping it had been something else. A car alarm somewhere down the street, a neighbor's dog knocking something over, anything other than what it clearly was. But then it rang again, a second press, short and deliberate, and I knew I couldn't just ignore it and hope it went away. I got up slowly, pulling the blanket off my legs and setting it aside, and I made my way toward the front door the way I always did, quiet on my feet, not bothering to flip the switch for the porch light. My hand found the wall beside the door out of habit, fingers brushing the light switch and then deliberately leaving it alone, and I leaned in close to the peephole, one eye pressed near the little glass lens, waiting for my vision to adjust to whatever was out there in the dark. It was very dark outside that night. I remember that clearly, because there was no moon visible, or if there was, it was hidden behind clouds, and the street light nearest my house had been flickering on and off for weeks by that point, one of those persistent problems the city never seemed to get around to fixing, no matter how many times someone must have called it in. So the porch itself was mostly swallowed in shadow, the kind of darkness where shapes only become visible because they're slightly different in texture or density from everything around them, silhouettes within silhouettes. And there was something there, not a person, not in the way I understood a person to look, not tall enough, not shaped right, but something small, low to the ground, somewhere around 3 or 4 feet in height if I had to guess, which even now unsettles me because that height would put it at about the size of a young child, or maybe just barely taller than one. It wasn't quite solid the way a normal object would look through a peephole at night, not a crisp outline you could trace with your eye. More like a blob of deeper black, set, against the background that was already nearly black itself, distinguishable only because it seemed somehow more opaque than the darkness surrounding it. A shape that blocked out what little ambient light there was, rather than simply blending into the absence of light, the way shadows usually do. And it was moving. That's the part that still catches in my throat every time I think back on it. The fact that it wasn't just standing there, wasn't just some strange trick of shadow and streetlight that a person could talk themselves out of given enough time to stare at it. It was dipping, low and rhythmic, bending down toward the ground and then rising again in a smooth, almost graceful motion. And as it moved, these two darker limbs, if that's even the right word for them, extended outward from its sides and swept through the air in wide, sweeping arcs, the way a person might move their arms if they were pretending to be a bird, wings spreading out and then drawing back in, over and over, in this slow, deliberate, almost hypnotic dance. I want to be honest about how strange this looked, because I've turned it over in my head more times than I can count, trying to find some mundane explanation that would let me stop thinking about it, and I've never managed to land on one. It wasn't the jerky, uneven movement of a plastic bag caught in the wind, which is the first thing everyone always suggests when I've told this story before, hoping to hand me an easy answer I can accept and move past. A bag doesn't dip and rise in that same steady rhythm every single time. Doesn't extend two distinct limbs to either side in a controlled, matching motion, like something following its own private choreography. What I was watching had intention behind it, or at least it felt that way in the pit of my stomach, even as my rational mind was scrambling to explain it away as something ordinary, something that made sense, something that wouldn't keep me lying awake later that night with the covers pulled up to my chin like I was 5 years old again. I stayed at that peephole for what felt like a long time, but was probably no more than 5 or 10 seconds. My heart starting to pound harder with every passing moment as I watched that shape dip and sway and spread its strange dark limbs against the porch shadows. My breath had gone shallow without me noticing, fogging faintly against the cold glass of the peephole lens. And I remember becoming acutely aware of every small sound in the house behind me. The hum of the refrigerator down the hall, the faint tick of the ceiling fan in the next room, as though my senses had suddenly sharpened themselves in response to whatever was happening just a few feet away on the other side of that door. Part of me wanted to call out, to ask who was there, the way you might if you thought it was simply a strange neighbor or a lost trick-or-treater who'd wandered up on the wrong night, but the words never made it past my throat. Something about the fluid, unhurried rhythm of that dipping motion told me, on some level deeper than conscious thought, that whatever was on my porch wasn't going to answer if I called out, and that calling out might only draw its attention toward the door in a way I very much did not want. And then it became too much. There's no better way to put it than that. Something about watching it, something about the wrongness of the motion, combined with the size of the thing. Small enough to seem almost harmless, and yet somehow that smallness made it worse. Made my skin crawl in a way that a large, obviously threatening shape might not have. I pulled back from the door fast, stepping away from the peephole like the glass itself might reach out and grab me, my breath coming quick and shallow, my back pressed for a second against the wall beside the door as though I needed something solid behind me to keep myself upright. I stood there in my dark hallway for a while, arguing with myself, half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing, half certain that if I dared to look again, I'd see something even worse waiting for me. The television was still playing in the other room, its light flickering faintly against the hallway wall, and the ordinary domestic sound of it felt strangely far away, like it belonged to a different, safer version of the evening than the one I was currently standing in. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I told myself it was probably some kid messing around, or a strange trick of shadow and streetlight combined with my own tired eyes playing games with me after a long day. I told myself all the things you tell yourself when you're trying to talk your body out of the fear your gut is absolutely certain is justified. Eventually, after what felt like a very long stretch of standing frozen in that hallway, I found enough nerve to move back toward the door. I don't know exactly what gave me the courage, whether it was simple curiosity finally winning out over fear, or whether it was the growing discomfort of not knowing, which somehow felt worse than the fear itself in that moment. I stepped up to the peephole again, slower this time, more hesitant, my hand trembling slightly as I leaned in close to the glass. Whatever it was gone. The porch was empty. Just the dark shapes of the railing and the edge of the steps. The same flickering streetlight down the block, casting its weak, inconsistent glow. The same ordinary emptiness you'd expect to see on any night when nobody happened to be standing there. No shape, no dipping motion, no strange dark limbs sweeping through the air. Nothing at all, as though it had simply never been there in the first place, as though I had conjured the entire thing out of nervous exhaustion and an overactive imagination, primed by too many nights spent alone in a house that already made too many strange settling noises after dark. I didn't open the door. I want to be clear about that. Even after seeing that the porch appeared empty, some deep, unshakable instinct told me not to test it further. Not to turn the porch light on, not to peek out through a window, not to do anything except back away from that door entirely and make sure every lock in the house was engaged. I checked the deadbolt twice, which I never do, running my fingers over it to confirm it was actually turned. The way you check something you already know is fine, but need to physically verify anyway, because your mind refuses to accept it on faith. Then I went back to the living room, but I didn't really watch the television anymore, not in any way that mattered. I just sat there with the volume up a little louder than usual, some part of me hoping the noise would drown out any other sound the house might decide to make, straining my ears anyway, despite myself, listening for footsteps on the porch, for the doorbell ringing again, for anything at all that would tell me whether that thing had actually left or was simply waiting somewhere just out of my sight. Nothing else happened that night. No further doorbell rings, no scratching at the door, no shadows passing across the curtains. Eventually, hours later, long after I probably should have gone to bed, exhaustion won out over fear, and I fell asleep on the couch with every light in the house left on, something I hadn't done since I was much younger and still afraid of ordinary childhood things like the dark itself, rather than whatever specific, nameless thing I had glimpsed through that peephole. For weeks after that night, I found myself unable to fully relax once the sun went down, even inside my own locked house with every light blazing. I started leaving the television on later than usual, sometimes all night, just for the company of voices and movement that weren't my own. I caught myself glancing toward the front windows more often than I used to, especially in that stretch of time right around dusk when the light outside turns that particular shade of deep blue-gray and shapes on the porch would be hardest to make out clearly, even with the porch light on. I never saw anything else out there, not once. Not so much as a stray cat crossing the yard, But the absence of anything didn't make the unease go away. If anything, it made it worse, because at least that first night I'd had something concrete to point to. Afterward, all I had was the waiting, the not knowing whether it might come back. And somehow that uncertainty settled into my chest and stayed there far longer than the fright of the actual sighting ever had. In the days that followed, I tried to come up with explanations, the way I imagine anyone would after something like that. I asked a couple of neighbors, carefully, without going into too much detail, whether they'd seen any kids in the neighborhood who might have been playing some kind of prank, dressed in something dark, messing around on porches after dark for fun, the way bored teenagers sometimes do. Nobody had any idea what I was talking about, and a couple of them looked at me strangely enough that I stopped asking after the third attempt. Worried I was starting to sound the way I actually felt, which was more shaken than I wanted to admit to people I mostly just waved to across the yard on trash day, people who, up until that point, had only ever known me as the quiet renter who kept to herself and never caused any trouble on the street. Looking back on those conversations, I remember one neighbor in particular, an older woman a few houses down, who I only really spoke to in passing, giving me a long, careful look before shaking her head and saying she hadn't seen or heard anything unusual, though something in her expression lingered a moment too long, as though she were deciding whether to say more and ultimately choosing not to. I've thought about that look more than I probably should have in the years since, wondering if she knew something about that street, about that particular stretch of houses, that she simply wasn't willing to share with someone she barely knew. I thought about animals too, obviously, because that's the practical explanation, the one that should have made the most sense. Maybe some large bird had landed on the porch railing and was doing something birds do, some strange mating display or territorial dance I simply wasn't familiar with. Maybe a raccoon or a stray cat had gotten into something that made it move in an odd way. Maybe caught in a torn plastic bag or a shredded piece of fabric that gave the illusion of limbs extending outward when it moved. I turned every possibility over in my head more times than I can count, and none of them ever quite fit what I actually saw. Birds don't stand 3 to 4 feet tall. Raccoons don't dip and rise in that smooth, rhythmic way, don't extend 2 limbs outward at once like something performing a slow, deliberate motion for an audience of one. The height bothers me most of all, even now, more than the strange dancing motion, more than the darkness of it, more than the way it seemed to vanish so completely between one glance and the next. 3 to 4 feet is not a large animal by most standards, and it's not the height of an adult person either, crouched or otherwise. It sits in this uncomfortable in-between space that doesn't match anything ordinary I can think of, small enough to seem like it shouldn't have been frightening at all, and yet somehow that exact size made the whole thing worse. Made it feel less like an animal and more like something that had chosen that particular size and shape for reasons of its own that I was never meant to understand. I even looked into local reports once, late one night when curiosity got the better of my usual instinct to just let the whole thing go. I searched around for anything resembling what I'd seen, strange sightings in the area, any local folklore about small dark figures appearing on porches or lawns after dark. I didn't find anything that matched cleanly, though I did come across a handful of scattered, unrelated accounts from other towns entirely, other states even, people describing small dark shapes glimpsed briefly at night. Always vague, always secondhand, always easy to dismiss individually, but strange to see repeated in isolated pockets by people who had no apparent connection to one another. None of it proved anything. None of it explained what I'd seen. But it was oddly comforting, in a small and complicated way, to know I wasn't the only person who had ever stood at a window or a door and watched something small and dark move in a way that didn't belong to anything I could name. I also thought, more than once, about the previous tenant my landlord had mentioned in passing, the one who'd left so abruptly before I moved in. I never learned the full story, and I never worked up the nerve to ask directly, worried that whatever answer I got would only make the nights that followed harder to get through. But I found myself wondering, in the weeks after that sighting, whether that person had seen something too, whether the porch light being awkwardly placed, whether the strange, hurried way they'd apparently left had anything to do with a small, dark shape that liked to dance in the dark, just beyond the reach of anyone brave enough to look. I moved out of that house about a year later, for reasons that had nothing to do with what happened that night, or at least nothing I could ever prove was connected. Rent went up, the landlord wanted to sell, ordinary reasons that have nothing supernatural about them at all. But I'll admit that some part of me was relieved to leave that particular front door behind, to move somewhere with a porch light that came on automatically at dusk. Somewhere with neighbors close enough on either side that a stranger or anything else dancing on my porch after dark would have been far more likely to draw attention. To this day, I still don't know what that was. I've told this story to a handful of people over the years, and the reactions tend to fall into predictable categories. Some people laugh it off, tell me it was obviously a bag, obviously an animal, obviously my tired eyes exaggerating something perfectly mundane into something frightening, because it was late and I was alone, and my imagination filled in details that weren't really there. I understand why people default to those explanations. I wanted one of them to be true, too, for a long time, because the alternative, that something small and strange and utterly unidentifiable stood on my porch in the dark and danced, arms spreading and sweeping like wings, only to vanish completely in the handful of seconds it took me to work up the nerve to look again, is not a thought that sits comfortably in anyone's mind, mine included. But I was there. I saw what I saw, and no explanation anyone has ever offered me since has managed to account for all of it at once. Not the height, not the opacity against an already dark background, not the deliberate rhythmic quality of that dipping, swaying, wing-sweeping motion. There's one more detail I've never quite known what to do with, something I only remembered clearly months later, long after I'd moved out of that house and into somewhere new. In the days right before that night, I'd noticed the porch light flickering on its own a few times, brief and inconsistent. The kind of thing you'd normally blame on a loose bulb or old wiring and think nothing more of. I never got around to fixing it, and after that night, I never had the chance to test whether it was actually the bulb at all, because I made sure never to rely on that light again, choosing instead to keep the peephole as my only window onto whatever might be waiting outside after dark. I don't know if the flickering meant anything. I don't know if it was connected at all to what I saw a few nights later. But looking back, it's the kind of small detail that sits uneasily in my memory. One more thread I can't quite tug loose from the rest of the story, no matter how many times I try. Even now, years later, and in a different house entirely. One with better lighting and closer neighbors and none of the strange. Unexplained history the old rental apparently carried, I still feel a small flicker of that same old dread whenever a doorbell rings unexpectedly after dark. I still walk to the door without turning on the light first, some habit too deeply set to unlearn. I still press my eye to the peephole slowly, bracing myself before I look. Some small part of me half expecting, every single time, to see that same small dark shape waiting there again. Dipping low, arms spreading wide, patient and graceful and utterly unexplainable. Exactly the way it looked the very first and only time I ever saw it. And exactly the way some quiet, stubborn part of me is still convinced, deep down, that I will see it again one of these nights, standing there in the dark, waiting patiently for me to finally work up the courage to open the door instead of just watching from behind the glass. This happened back in the late 80s, maybe stretching into the very early 90s, when I was around 6 or 7 years old. My older sister was 14 or 15 at the time, old enough that our parents trusted her to watch me whenever they needed a night out, which happened fairly often back then. We grew up in a small town out in West Texas, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody else's business, where the mail carrier knew your name and the woman at the grocery store asked about your grandmother by name without you ever having introduced yourself. It was a tight, familiar kind of place, the sort of town where nothing ever seemed to happen, which is part of what makes what happened that night stick with me the way it has for all these years since. My sister and I got along well despite the age gap between us. She never seemed to mind having me tag along or having to watch me on the nights our parents went out, and I looked up to her the way little brothers usually look up to older sisters, thinking she knew everything worth knowing about the world. Our house was a single-story ranch-style place, fairly typical for that part of Texas, with a long gravel driveway out front and a chain-link fence running around the backyard where our dog used to sleep most nights curled up on the back step. Though, for whatever reason, he wasn't out there that particular evening, kept inside instead because of the cold. On the particular night I'm remembering, our parents were out somewhere. I don't even remember where anymore, and the two of us were home alone the way we so often were, comfortable in that familiar routine of takeout and television that filled most of our evenings together. It was around 8 o'clock at night, deep into winter, which meant it got dark early and the cold settled in hard once the sun went down. People don't always realize how cold the desert gets once night falls, but out there in West Texas, the temperature could drop fast and hard, the daytime heat completely gone by the time true darkness set in. We were sitting in the common room of the house, which is where the television was kept. The two of us curled up on the floor in front of it the way kids do, half paying attention and half just enjoying the noise and light of the screen, filling up the quiet of an otherwise empty house. We were watching one of those hour-long news programs that used to run all the time back then, the kind that dug deep into real crimes, kidnappings, murders, disappearances, presenting them almost like documentary specials, dramatic music and all. I don't remember exactly which show it was. There were several that all blurred together in style, but I remember the story clearly enough. It was about a quiet man who had lived next door to a family for years without anyone suspecting a thing, and then, one night, had gone into their house and hurt them terribly, taking their young daughter with him afterward. The show was following the manhunt that had followed, police searching for a man who had simply vanished after doing something unthinkable to people who had lived right beside him. I remember the reporter's voice more than anything else. That particular somber, serious tone those shows always used, describing how neighbors had said the man kept to himself, how nobody had ever suspected he was capable of something so terrible, how he'd simply been the quiet guy down the street that everyone waved to without really knowing at all. Even at 6 or 7 years old, something about that idea unsettled me. The notion that a person could live right next door to you could seem completely ordinary and still be hiding something so dark underneath. Now, to understand what happened next, you need to understand the layout of that common room, because it mattered a lot once things started going wrong. One entire wall of the room was made up of floor-to-ceiling glass, a big sliding door that led out to the backyard with windows stretching up on either side of it. At night, with no light turned on out back, that whole wall turned into a sheet of solid blackness, reflecting the room back at you rather than showing anything of what might be outside. We never left the backlight on unless we were actually planning to go out there, So most nights that wall was just this looming dark expanse at the edge of the room, easy enough to ignore when the television was playing and everything felt normal. On the opposite side of the common room was the front door, tucked into a small entryway that led out toward the porch. Unlike the back, the front door was solid, no windows in it at all, so you couldn't see through to whatever might be standing on the other side. Outside that solid door was a second door, a glass and screened storm door, the kind a lot of houses in that area had back then to help keep the worst of the wind and dust out during storms. About 45 minutes into the program, right as the reporters on screen were talking about how the search for this man was still ongoing, still unresolved. With no sign of where he'd gone or where he might be hiding, the front door exploded with noise. 3 hard bangs, loud and fast, like someone slamming their fist against it with everything they had. My sister and I both jumped up off the floor at the same instant, screaming without even meaning to, some pure animal reaction taking over before either of us had time to think about what was actually happening. Then, everything went silent again, dead quiet, the kind that presses in on your ears after a sudden loud noise, made even heavier by the fact that neither of us could catch our breath enough to speak. The only light in the house at that point came from the kitchen down the hallway, left on out of habit, and the flickering glow of the television, still playing whatever came after the segment we'd been watching, though neither of us was paying attention to it anymore. We stood there frozen for a second, and then, trying to make sense of what we'd just heard, we told ourselves it was probably nothing, just something out on the porch. We had a couple of planters out there, and an old wooden rocking chair that my mother liked to sit in during warmer months, and West Texas wind could get vicious, strong enough to knock things around and slam them into whatever was nearby. It made sense, or at least it made enough sense that we wanted to believe it. A minute or two passed in silence, the two of us clutching each other on the floor where we'd ended up sitting again, our hearts still hammering from that first jolt of fear. Slowly, we started to relax, that dangerous kind of relaxing that comes right after a scare, when your body starts convincing your mind that the danger must be over simply because nothing else has happened yet. We were just on the edge of deciding everything was fine, that it really had just been the wind and a rocking chair, when we heard the storm door outside the front door swing shut. That sound stopped everything cold. Because for that storm door to close, somebody had to have opened it first. A gust of wind could maybe knock a chair into the front door, could rattle a loose screen, but it doesn't open a storm door and then let it swing shut on its own. Not typically. Not without something or someone standing right there to have opened it in the first place. My sister and I looked at each other, both of us realizing the same thing at the same moment, and I don't think either of us said a word, but I remember the look on her face, the color draining out of it and the dim kitchen light spilling into the room. We were both frozen in the middle of that common room floor, right where we'd been sitting to watch the show earlier, not moving, barely breathing, both of us straining to hear even the smallest sound from beyond that heavy front door. I don't know how long we stayed like that, trapped in that terrible stillness, glancing between each other and then toward the front door and then back to each other again, waiting for something else to happen, dreading it and needing it at the same time. The uncertainty somehow worse than whatever might actually come next. My sister eventually crawled over to the television, still on her hands and knees, reaching up to turn the old dial that shut it off, the kind of set you had to physically twist rather than press a button on. It clicked off with a heavy mechanical thunk that seemed unbelievably loud in that quiet room, loud enough that I flinched at the sound of it, even though I'd known it was coming. Now the only light left in the house was that dim glow spilling in from the kitchen down the hallway, barely enough to make out shapes in the common room, everything else swallowed in shadow. I don't know how much time passed after that. It felt like a very long time, though I'm sure in reality it couldn't have been more than a few minutes, each second stretching out far longer than it should have. The way time always seems to slow down when you're too afraid to move. I was on my knees, sitting back on my heels the way kids do, and at some point during that stretch of silence, I turned myself around to face the back wall, that long expanse of glass doors and windows leading out to the yard. That's when I saw the doorknob on the back door start to turn. It was locked, thank God, locked on the knob itself, even though we never bothered with the deadbolt back there, but the knob still moved, twisting slightly one way and then back, the way it would if someone on the other side was gently, carefully testing whether it would give. I remember watching that little brass knob rotate in the dim light, my whole body gone rigid, unable to make a single sound, my breath caught somewhere deep in my chest. Then it stopped being gentle. All at once, the door started jerking violently back and forth, someone throwing their weight against it, or trying to force the lock, or simply shaking the whole frame in a wild, furious attempt to get it open. The bang of it against the frame was tremendous. Bam, 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 one right after another, and the entire wall of glass shuddered with each impact, the windows rattling in their frames hard enough that I could see my own dim reflection blur and warp, and then sharpen again with every violent jerk of that door. Over and over, my small reflected face flickering in and out of focus in that shaking glass. I remember thinking, in that strange, detached way your mind sometimes works during moments of pure terror, that whoever or whatever was doing this had to be strong, stronger than any person I could picture, because the whole frame of that sliding door was built solid. Heavy aluminum and thick glass meant to survive the kind of windstorms that regularly tore through that part of Texas, and yet it was shaking in its track like it weighed nothing at all. The sound seemed to fill the entire house, bouncing off the walls of that common room, so loud I couldn't hear anything else. Not even my own sister breathing beside me. Not even the blood pounding in my own ears the way I would have expected. It felt like it went on forever, though I know now it must have only lasted a handful of seconds before it finally stopped as abruptly as it had started, the sudden silence afterward, somehow, just as frightening as the noise itself had been. Because at least the noise told us where the danger was. The silence told us nothing, except that we no longer knew. My sister lost it completely at that point. She let out a scream that didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard from her before. Something raw and pure and terrified in a way that 14-year-old girls aren't supposed to sound. I stayed frozen where I was on the floor, unable to move even as everything in me was screaming to run, my body simply refusing to respond to whatever signals my brain was trying to send it. My sister didn't wait for me to snap out of it. She scrambled up, grabbed hold of me, and half dragged, half carried me down the hall and into her bedroom, slamming the door shut behind us the instant we were both through it. She started shoving things in front of that door immediately, her mattress first, wrestling it off the bed frame and jamming it up against the door, then anything else within reach, a dresser drawer she yanked free and dumped on top, whatever she could grab in the dark without wasting time looking for anything better. I remember watching her do all of this in a kind of daze, my whole body shaking so hard I couldn't have helped her even if my mind had been clear enough to try. Thankfully, in the middle of all that panic, she'd remembered to grab the phone off the wall on our way past the kitchen. One of those old, heavy, cordless phones with a long rubber antenna sticking up out of the top, the kind that weighed almost as much as a brick and never seemed to hold a charge for very long. The problem was, in her panic, she couldn't remember our sheriff's direct number. Her mind wiped blank by fear the way minds sometimes go when the moment demands you remember something simple, and instead you can't recall anything at all. So she hit redial instead, calling back whoever she'd last spoken to, which turned out to be one of her friends from school. I remember her voice on that call, broken up between gasping breaths, barely holding together enough to get the words out, telling her friend that someone was trying to break into our house, that we needed help, that they needed to get someone here right now, using language I'd never heard my sister use before, the kind of words that in any other moment would have gotten her in serious trouble with our parents. But nobody was thinking about manners or rules in that bedroom, not with the sound of that back door still echoing in both our memories, not knowing if whoever had been trying to get in was still out there, maybe circling the house now, maybe trying some other window or door we hadn't thought to check. I curled up on the floor of that bedroom, pressed into the corner between the wall and the dresser my sister had dragged in front of the door, and I could not stop shaking, my teeth actually chattering despite the fact that the house wasn't even that cold inside. We didn't hear anything else happen after that. No more banging, no more rattling doorknobs, nothing at all except our own ragged breathing and my sister's voice on the phone, quieter now, trying to explain to her friend exactly where we lived and how fast they needed to get there. Those minutes waiting in that bedroom felt endless in a way that's hard to explain to anyone who wasn't there. My sister sat with her back pressed against the barricaded door, phone still clutched in her hand even after the call had ended. And every few seconds her eyes would dart toward the window, toward the closet, toward every possible way something might get into that room, even though we both knew, logically, that we'd blocked the only door, and the window was too small and too high up for anyone to fit through. Logic didn't matter much in that moment. Fear doesn't listen to logic. Not when you're 7 years old, curled up on a bedroom floor with your teeth chattering. Not even when you're 14 and trying to be brave for your little brother while your own hands won't stop shaking. I remember my sister reaching over at some point and pulling me close against her side, wrapping her arm tight around my shoulders. And even though she was scared too, even though I could feel her trembling just as much as I was, having her there made it bearable in a way that being alone in that room never could have been. We didn't talk much during that wait. There wasn't much to say. We just sat there together, listening as hard as we possibly could to the silence of the rest of the house, trying to catch any hint of movement, any sound at all that would tell us whether whatever had been at that back door was still out there somewhere, circling, waiting, or whether it had truly given up and gone. It felt like forever before we finally saw headlights swing into our driveway, sweeping bright across the ceiling of my sister's bedroom through the gap beneath the curtains. It was her friend's parents, driving over as fast as they safely could once they understood something was seriously wrong, arriving with their own porch lights blazing and doors slamming as they hurried up to our house. My sister and I practically fell out of that bedroom when we heard familiar voices calling out to us from the front hallway, both of us crying by that point, the fear finally breaking loose now that we knew we weren't alone anymore. The sheriff came out not long after that, walking the perimeter of the house with a flashlight, checking every window and door, the front porch, the backyard, all of it. He was a heavy-set older man, someone my parents actually knew a little from around town, the way everyone seemed to know everyone in a place that small. And he took his time going over every inch of the property, ducking under the eaves along the back wall, crouching down to look closely at the ground beneath the windows for any footprints the cold, hard dirt might have preserved. There was nothing to find. No footprints in any usable shape. No signs of forced entry beyond what we'd already heard and felt for ourselves. He asked us both a string of questions, gentle at first, and then more pointed. Whether we'd seen anyone hanging around the house in the days before, Whether either of us had noticed a strange car parked along the street, whether we'd had any trouble with anyone in town lately. We didn't have any real answers for him. Nothing stood out. Nobody we could think of had any reason to want to scare two kids half to death on an ordinary Tuesday night. He told my parents, once they finally got home and heard the whole story from us in pieces, that it was probably kids messing around, some prank that had gotten out of hand. Though I remember the look on his face didn't quite match the reassurance in his voice, like even he wasn't fully convinced by his own explanation. The only thing anyone noticed, and even this wasn't certain, were a couple of faint scuff marks along the bottom of the back door, the kind of marks that could have come from someone kicking or shoving at it, or could just as easily have been there for weeks already, left over from something as mundane as moving furniture or dragging in firewood. Neither my sister nor I able to say for certain whether we'd simply never noticed them before that night. We never found out who had been at that door, or why, or how they managed to open the storm door and then vanish so completely that not even the sheriff, walking the property with a flashlight, could turn up a single solid trace of them. The timing with that news story about the man in the manhunt always stuck with me, an unsettling coincidence that my young mind couldn't help connecting. Even though there was never a single piece of actual evidence tying the two things together, nothing beyond the discomfort of watching a story about a dangerous man on the loose while our own house seemed to come under attack less than an hour later. Nothing like that ever happened again. Not to me, not to my sister, not in all the years we continued living in that house afterward. We grew up, moved out eventually the way kids do, went on with our lives. But to this day, decades later, neither of us has ever forgotten to lock every single door in a house we're staying in, front and back, deadbolt included, no matter how safe the neighborhood seems, no matter how many other locks are already in place. Old habits, once they're carved into you deeply enough by a single terrifying night, have a way of staying with you for the rest of your life, whether you want them to or not. My sister and I still talk about that night sometimes, usually around the holidays when the whole family gets together and the conversation drifts, the way it always does, toward old memories from that house we grew up in. She tells it a little differently than I do. Remembers small details I've lost over the years, the exact friend she called, the way our mother's face went pale when she came home and heard the story from the sheriff before either of us had even finished telling it ourselves. But the core of it never changes, no matter who's telling it. The banging on the front door, the storm door swinging shut on its own, that back door shaking in its frame like something desperate and furious, was determined to get inside no matter what stood in its way. Even now, whenever I'm home alone at night and the wind picks up outside, rattling a screen door or knocking something loose against the wall, some part of me tenses up before my rational mind can catch up and remind me it's probably nothing. Probably just the weather. The same reassurance my sister and I told ourselves that night, right before everything got so much worse. I still think about that back door sometimes. The sight of my own reflection, warping in and out of focus with every violent jerk of the frame, and I still wonder, all these years later, what exactly was standing on the other side of that glass, trying so hard to get in, and why, after everything, it simply gave up and disappeared into the dark without ever being seen by anyone at all. It's a strange thing to carry with you into adulthood. A piece of unfinished fear from childhood that never quite got resolved. No arrest, no explanation, no final answer that would let either of us set it down completely and stop wondering. My sister says the same thing whenever we talk about it now, that the not knowing is somehow the hardest part. Harder even than the memory of that violent shaking door itself, because a mystery like that never really closes. It just quiets down for a while, before some small sound in the night brings it rushing right back. My grandmother has lived for as long as I can remember in a house that was built sometime in the late 1700s. One of those genuinely old properties you don't come across very often anymore. The kind with thick original walls and low doorways built for people who were a fair bit shorter than we are today. Floors that dip and slope in places from centuries of settling into the ground beneath them. The house has been in the family for generations, passed down through relatives I only know from old photographs and half-remembered stories my grandmother tells at holiday dinners. Faded sepia images of stern-faced ancestors in stiff collars and long dresses standing in front of that same doorway. Generations of a family I only partially understand my own connection to, and she's always spoken about it with a kind of quiet pride. The sense that living in something that old, something that's outlasted so many other families and so much change in the surrounding town, matters to her in a way that's hard to fully put into words if you haven't grown up around that kind of history yourself. The house sits on a piece of land that has old graveyards bordering it on both sides. Small family plots and church burial grounds that predate most of the surrounding town, the headstones worn smooth and unreadable in places from more than 200 years of weather, working steadily against the soft stone. Some of the stones have toppled over entirely, half sunk into the earth, their inscriptions long since erased by rain and wind and the slow, patient work of 2 centuries passing over them. Growing up, I never thought much of it. It was simply where my grandmother lived, and the graveyards were just part of the landscape. Something you walked past on the way to the garden, or the old cobblestone driveway that curved along the side of the property. More a feature of the scenery than anything that ever felt threatening or strange. I used to ride my bike along the low stone wall separating the yard from the older graveyard when I was a kid, never once feeling uneasy about it. The way children often accept whatever surrounds them without question, simply because it's always been there, the headstone's just another feature of the landscape, like the old oak trees or the crooked garden fence. Nothing about any of it registering as unusual until years later, when I actually stopped to think about how strange it might seem to anyone who hadn't grown up around it the way I had. A few days ago, a friend of mine, someone I hadn't seen in person for several months, came by to visit. He'd spent that stretch of time away at a drug treatment program, working hard to get his life back on track after a difficult couple of years that had worried all of us who cared about him, and I was genuinely glad to see him looking healthier and steadier than he had in a long while. More color in his face. A kind of calm settled into him that I hadn't seen since we were teenagers, before everything got complicated. We ended up walking together along that same old cobblestone driveway at my grandmother's house, catching up the way you do after a long absence. The two of us falling back into the easy rhythm of conversation we'd always had, even after all those months apart, the stones worn smooth beneath our feet from centuries of footsteps that had come long before either of us. And at some point, the conversation drifted toward what he'd been going through during treatment. Not just the practical, difficult work of getting sober, but something deeper that had apparently shifted in him along the way. He started talking about a kind of newfound spirituality he'd developed, careful to clarify that he didn't mean it in a religious sense. Not church or scripture or anything organized like that, but more a feeling of being tuned in, as he put it, more attuned somehow to things around him that he hadn't noticed or felt before. A kind of heightened awareness he'd stumbled into during the quiet, reflective stretches of his recovery. He described it as something that had crept up on him slowly during the long, structured days of the program, meditation sessions and quiet hours that had apparently opened something up in him he hadn't known was there before, a sensitivity to atmosphere and energy that he struggled to fully articulate, even as he tried his best to explain it to me. I believed him without much hesitation. Recovery from something as serious as what he'd been through often comes with exactly that kind of internal shift, a kind of cerebral or spiritual awakening that people describe after facing down something that difficult and coming out the other side of it changed. I listened to him talk about it as we walked, genuinely happy for whatever peace he seemed to have found, not thinking for a second that anything he was describing had anything to do with what was about to happen. As we were talking, my grandmother's cat wandered over and started rubbing against my leg, the way cats do when they want attention or food or simply feel like being near you. She was an older cat by that point, a calm, somewhat aloof animal who'd never been particularly demanding of attention in all the years my grandmother had owned her, content most days to sleep in whatever patch of sunlight happened to be available and largely ignore visitors unless food was involved. The kind of cat you had to actively seek out for affection rather than one who came looking for it herself. I didn't think anything of it at first, reached down absently to scratch behind her ears while continuing the conversation with my friend, expecting her to wander off again the way she usually did after getting a little affection. But she didn't leave. She kept circling back, rubbing insistently against my leg again and again, weaving between my ankles in a way that started to feel less like ordinary affection and more like she was trying, quite deliberately, to get my attention for something specific. After a while, it became impossible to ignore. She wasn't behaving like herself, not the casual come-and-go affection she normally offered, but something more urgent, more insistent, almost frantic in the way she kept pressing herself against me and then pulling back, looking up at me, then walking a few steps away before turning back to look again, the way you might expect a dog to behave if it were trying to lead you somewhere. Not typical cat behavior at all, in my experience. I stopped talking mid-sentence at one point, genuinely distracted by it, and my friend noticed too, both of us watching her with a kind of confused curiosity as she continued this strange, deliberate routine. I decided to follow her, mostly out of curiosity at that point, half expecting her to just be leading me toward her food bowl or some toy she'd lost under a bush. But as she walked ahead of me, weaving through the yard with clear purpose, I started to realize where she was actually heading. And a small, uneasy feeling started to settle into my stomach even before I fully understood why. She was walking straight toward the graveyard bordering the property, the older of the two, the one closest to the house itself, moving with a steady, determined pace that didn't waver or hesitate the way a cat's aimless wandering usually does. The evening light was already starting to fade by that point, the sky shifting into that particular deep orange and purple that settles in just before true dusk, the temperature dropping noticeably with each passing minute the way it does in early autumn, and the shadows cast by the old headstones ahead of us were stretching long and thin across the uneven grass, giving the whole scene a heaviness that felt entirely out of proportion for what, on paper, was simply a cat wandering across a familiar yard. Every time I slowed down or stopped, unsure whether I actually wanted to keep following her into a graveyard at dusk, she would turn around immediately and come back, rubbing hard against my leg again, almost insistent, until I started walking once more. It happened 3 or 4 times, this pattern of me hesitating and her circling back to physically press against me until I resumed following, and each time it happened, the uneasy feeling in my stomach grew a little stronger, because it genuinely felt less like a cat wandering and more like she was making sure I didn't turn back. Like whatever she was trying to communicate mattered enough to her that she wasn't going to let me lose interest halfway there. At one point, I actually laughed a little, nervously, trying to shake off how strange the whole situation had started to feel, joking to my friend that our cat had apparently decided to become a tour guide, though neither of us really found it funny enough to laugh along with me. My friend walked along beside me the whole time, quiet now, none of the easy conversational tone from earlier still present between us. I glanced over at him once and saw that his expression had changed too, something more focused and unsettled in his face, his eyes tracking the cat with an intensity that seemed to match the strange gravity of the moment, and I remember him saying, quietly, that he felt like something wanted us to keep going. A comment that at any other time I might have brushed off as him still processing whatever new spiritual awareness he developed during treatment. But in that specific moment, walking behind an unusually insistent cat toward an old graveyard as the lights started to fade, it didn't feel like an exaggeration at all. He mentioned, almost under his breath, that the feeling reminded him of something he'd experienced once during a meditation session at the treatment center. A sense of being pulled toward something rather than choosing to move on his own. Though he trailed off before finishing the thought, seemingly unsure himself how much of it he wanted to put into words out loud. When we finally reached the edge of the graveyard, the cat didn't slow down or hesitate the way I might have expected once we actually arrived. She walked directly to one particular headstone among the dozens scattered across that section of ground. An older stone, weathered and tilted slightly the way so many of them were out there, its inscription barely visible in the dim light, and without any pause at all, she leapt straight up onto the narrow top edge of it, balancing herself on that thin strip of stone with a precision that struck me as almost deliberate, like she'd done it before, like she knew exactly where her paws needed to land. It wasn't a wide, flat-topped stone the way some of the newer ones nearby were. This particular headstone had a rounded, narrow crest, barely wide enough to seem like a stable place for a cat to stand at all, and yet she balanced there without the slightest wobble, 4 paws drawn neatly together, perfectly poised in a way that seemed to defy the actual physical difficulty of the position she'd chosen. She wouldn't move after that. She simply sat there, perfectly balanced on that narrow ridge of stone, staring off toward the house, completely unbothered by either of us standing there watching her. Her tail curled neatly around her paws, ears upright and alert, eyes fixed on something neither of us could see. I approached slowly, intending to pick her up and carry her back, assuming this whole strange episode had run its course now that she'd apparently led us to wherever she'd been trying to go. The moment my hands got close to her, though, she reacted immediately and violently, hissing loud and sharp, her whole body tensing, ears flattening back against her skull, fur bristling along her spine in a way I'd genuinely never seen from her before in all the years I'd known her, a reaction so far outside her normal temperament that I actually pulled my hands back reflexively, startled by how genuinely aggressive she'd become in an instant. We tried a couple more times, my friend attempting it once as well, thinking maybe she was simply reacting to me specifically for some reason, but she responded the exact same way to him, hissing and swiping at the air between us the second either of us got close enough to actually touch her, refusing outright to be moved from that particular spot on that particular headstone, no matter what either of us tried, no matter how gently we approached or how much distance we gave her before trying again. Eventually we stepped back and just looked at the stone itself, reading what was left of the inscription carved into it, worn down significantly by weather and time, but still legible enough in the fading light to make out a name and a set of dates. The years carved into that stone placed the person's death well over a century before either my friend or I had been born, a fact that only made the whole situation feel stranger, more distant somehow, and yet somehow more real at the same time. It didn't take long after that for the pieces to click together in a way that made the whole situation feel considerably heavier than it had a few minutes before. We went back inside and asked my grandmother about the name, and she confirmed what we'd already started to suspect standing out there in the graveyard. The person buried beneath that headstone had lived and eventually died inside the very house we'd just walked away from, generations before any of us had ever set foot in it ourselves. My grandmother sat us both down at her kitchen table while she explained what little she actually knew about the name, pulling out an old family record book she kept in a drawer near the stove, the pages soft and brittle at the edges from decades of handling, flipping through pages of handwritten notes and dates that traced the ownership of the house back further than I'd ever actually bothered to ask about before. Entire branches of a family tree I only half recognized from the handful of names that overlapped with stories I'd heard growing up. She told us the woman buried in that grave had spent her entire life in that house, born there, married there, and eventually passed away there as well, sometime in her elderly years, according to the sparse details recorded in that old book. A life lived entirely within those same walls from beginning to end without ever once leaving the property for anywhere else. There wasn't much more detail than that. No dramatic story attached to her death, as far as my grandmother knew. Nothing that would obviously explain why a cat more than a century and a half later would feel compelled to lead two grown men directly to her particular headstone out of dozens of others scattered across that same graveyard. My grandmother didn't seem particularly surprised by any of it, which in hindsight unsettled me almost as much as the cat's behavior had. She's lived in that house long enough, surrounded by those graveyards long enough, that odd occurrences involving that particular section of the property apparently weren't entirely new to her, though she'd never gone into much detail about it before that day, and even then she only offered a few vague comments about the house having history before changing the subject, the way older relatives sometimes do when they clearly know more than they're willing to say outright. When I pressed her a little further, asking if anything like this had happened before, she simply said that old houses like hers tend to hold on to things longer than people expect, and that she'd learned a long time ago not to go looking too closely into every strange thing that happened around that property, advice that, at the time, struck me as oddly practiced, like something she'd said to herself many times over the years to keep from dwelling on it too much, a line she'd perhaps rehearsed for exactly this kind of moment, whenever it eventually came. My friend, for his part, was visibly shaken by the whole thing, in a way that felt different from ordinary surprise, quieter than usual for the rest of the visit, glancing occasionally back toward the graveyard as we walked back up toward the house, like he expected to see something else out there if he looked long enough. He mentioned again, once we were finally back inside with the door shut behind us, that whatever feeling he'd developed during his time in treatment, that sense of being tuned in he tried to describe earlier, had been almost overwhelming out there by that headstone, stronger than anything he said he'd experienced since leaving the program, though he struggled to put into words exactly what it was he'd actually felt. He described it, eventually, as something like standing too close to a speaker at a concert, not quite painful, but impossible to ignore. A pressure that seemed to sit behind his eyes the whole time we stood near that grave, and only started to ease once we put real distance between ourselves and that section of the yard. A description that stuck with me long after that night, simply because of how specific and unusual it was, not the vague, generic language people often reach for when trying to describe something they can't quite explain. While we were still standing near the grave, before the cat finally allowed herself to be coaxed down on her own terms several minutes later, my friend had taken a photo on his phone, capturing her perched there on that narrow stone edge, hissing at whichever one of us had gotten too close in that particular moment. He hadn't even really thought about it in the moment, he told me later, just an instinct to document something that clearly felt important as it was happening. The way you might reach for your phone during any other strange or notable event without fully processing why you're doing it. Looking at that picture afterward, later that same evening, sitting together in my grandmother's kitchen with the lights on and the doors locked, both of us kept coming back to it, examining it over and over, unable to fully articulate what exactly unsettled us so much about the image beyond the obvious fact of what had led to it being taken in the first place. My friend zoomed in at one point on the cat's eyes in the photo, and neither of us could decide afterward whether it was simply a trick of the phone's flash, catching the light strangely, or whether there was genuinely something off about the way they looked in that single frozen frame, wide and fixed on something just out of view of the camera. There's something about a photograph that makes an experience like that feel more solid, harder to explain away afterward as some trick of imagination or coincidence. The cat frozen there in that image exactly as we'd seen her in person, balanced impossibly on that thin ridge of stone, glaring out at whoever dared come near. We ended up sitting at that kitchen table far later into the night than either of us had planned, the conversation looping back again and again to the same handful of unanswerable questions, my grandmother eventually going up to bed and leaving the two of us there with the photo still pulled up between us on the table. My friend admitted, somewhere around midnight, that part of what unsettled him most wasn't really the cat's behavior itself, strange as it was, but the fact that his own newfound sensitivity, whatever exactly it was, had apparently picked up on something out there before either of us had any concrete reason to feel uneasy at all, as if some part of him had already known something was different about that particular graveyard long before the cat ever moved from my side. Neither of us has been able to come up with a satisfying explanation for any of it since. Cats are sensitive animals, certainly, capable of picking up on things humans might miss entirely. Changes in temperature or scent or sound that could theoretically explain unusual behavior. I've read since, in the days after all of this happened, that cats are sometimes credited with sensing things people can't. Subtle vibrations in the ground, shifts in air pressure, scents carried on the wind from sources too faint for a human nose to register at all, and I've turned those explanations over in my head more times than I can count, trying to find a version of events that lets me file the whole afternoon away as something explainable, something ordinary, dressed up by circumstance, and my own overactive imagination into feeling far stranger than it actually was. But none of that quite accounts for the deliberateness of what happened. The insistence with which she led me specifically to that one grave out of dozens scattered across that section of the property, refusing to let me turn back even when I clearly wanted to, or the balance she maintained on that narrow stone edge, a feat that still strikes me as almost too precise for coincidence, or the ferocity with which she refused to be moved from it once she'd arrived, hissing and swiping at two grown men who had never once, in all the years either of us had known her, seen her behave with anything close to that kind of aggression. Nor does it explain my friend's reaction, the way his newly developed sensitivity apparently keyed into whatever was happening out there well before the cat ever gave either of us a concrete reason to feel uneasy, as though he'd been picking up on something the rest of us simply weren't equipped to notice. My grandmother still lives in that house, still keeps that same cat. And as far as I know, nothing quite like that has happened again since, though I find myself, whenever I visit now, watching her a little more closely whenever we happen to walk anywhere near that graveyard, half expecting, and honestly half hoping, that whatever guided her there that day has said whatever it needed to say, and has no further reason to reach out again. My friend and I still talk about it sometimes when we catch up, usually circling back around to that photo on his phone still saved there months later, the two of us studying it again as though a longer look might finally reveal something we'd both missed the first dozen times we'd gone over it. Neither of us has ever come up with anything more solid than the same handful of half-formed theories we started with that night at my grandmother's kitchen table, and I suspect, at this point, we probably never will. Some afternoons, I find myself standing at the edge of that old graveyard on my own, looking out at that particular headstone from a distance, wondering what exactly that woman who lived and died within those same walls generations ago might have wanted from two strangers who happened to be walking by on an ordinary evening, and wondering, too, whether she got it or whether she's still out there, waiting for the next visitor our grandmother's cat decides is worth leading down that same cobblestone path. I have always been the kind of person who does laundry on a set schedule, because if I don't stick to a routine, I end up letting it pile up for weeks until I'm digging through a mountain of clothes looking for something clean to wear. So every few days, usually in the evening after work, I would head down to the basement with a hamper under my arm and get it done. It was such a normal part of my week that I never gave it a second thought. The basement wasn't anything special. It was just a basement, the kind you find under a lot of older houses, unfinished in most places, with exposed pipes running along the ceiling and a concrete floor that stayed cold no matter what time of year it was. The layout of it was a little unusual compared to some basements I had seen in other houses. It was split into two separate sections by a wall with a door in the middle. One side held the laundry room itself, with the washer, the dryer, a folding table, and shelves stacked with detergent and old boxes we never got around to unpacking. The other side was the larger open part of the basement, mostly used for storage, old furniture we didn't have space for upstairs, a workbench my dad barely used anymore, that kind of thing. The only way to get from the laundry room back up to the rest of the house was to walk out of that room, cross through the entire open section of the basement, and climb the stairs on the far end. There was no shortcut, no second door, no way around it. If you wanted to do laundry, you had to walk through that space, both coming and going. For the most part, I never thought twice about that layout. It was just how the house was built, and I had walked through that basement more times than I could count without a single problem. It was the kind of place that felt a little creepy in the abstract, the way basements always do, but in practice it was just boring. Boxes, cobwebs in the corners, the low hum of the furnace kicking on and off. Nothing more than that. One evening, I went down to do a load of laundry like I always did. I remember it being a pretty unremarkable day up to that point. Nothing out of the ordinary at all. I walked through the open part of the basement, flipped the light switch like I always did without even really thinking about it, and stepped into the laundry room to start sorting clothes. It was only after I had already gotten a load going and had a few minutes to just stand there folding a couple things from the previous load that I noticed something felt off. It took me a second to place it. Then I realized the light in the other part of the basement, the part I had just walked through, had never actually turned on. I had flipped the switch out of habit, barely glancing at it, and my brain had just assumed it worked because it always had before. I stepped over to the laundry room door and looked out into the main part of the basement to confirm what I was already starting to suspect. Sure enough, the space beyond the laundry room was completely dark. Not dim, not shadowy, but the kind of dark where you genuinely cannot make out the shape of furniture more than a few feet away from you. That side of the basement only had the one light fixture in the middle of the ceiling, an old-style bulb that had clearly finally given out after who knows how many years of use. There were no windows on that side either, since it was mostly below ground level. So once that bulb went, the whole space just dropped into total darkness. I stood there for a second, weighing my options. I could go back upstairs immediately and deal with it later, but I still had another load of laundry sitting in the hamper that I really needed to get through. Mostly work clothes I needed clean for the next morning. So I made the decision to just finish what I was doing first and worry about the dark walk back through the basement afterward. In hindsight, I think some part of me was already dreading it, already trying to put off that walk for as long as possible, folding clothes a little slower than I normally would have, taking my time wiping down the top of the dryer, anything to delay stepping back out into that dark space. Eventually, though, I ran out of things to occupy myself with in the laundry room. The second load was still running, but there was nothing left for me to actually do down there. I had homework waiting upstairs, dinner needed to be started, and I couldn't reasonably stay locked in a laundry room all evening just because the other side of the basement had gone dark. So I took a breath, told myself I was being ridiculous, and opened the door. The moment I stepped through that doorway, the light from the laundry room behind me only reached a few feet before the darkness swallowed it up completely. I could vaguely make out the general shapes of the old furniture along the walls, just enough to know roughly where not to walk into anything. But beyond that, everything blurred into a solid, heavy black. The stairs on the far side of the room felt impossibly distant in that moment, even though I knew logically it was maybe 25 feet away at most. A walk that normally took me all of 5 or 6 seconds with the light on. I started walking, keeping my steps steady, trying to focus on getting to those stairs without letting my imagination run away from me. I could hear my own breathing louder than usual in the quiet of the basement, and the concrete floor felt colder somehow through my socks than it normally did. I made it about halfway across the room, right around where I remembered the old workbench being off to my left, when I heard it. It came from directly behind me, not from somewhere off in the distance, not muffled through a wall, but close enough that I could practically feel it in the air around me. A loud, sharp cackle, the kind of sound people make when they're doing an exaggerated impression of a cartoon witch, that rising, cracking laugh you'd hear in an old Halloween special. Except it wasn't quite that. If you can imagine that same witch cackle, but stretched and roughened, like the throat producing it had spent 50 years smoking unfiltered cigarettes, deep and hoarse and scraping, that's the closest I can come to describing what I actually heard. It wasn't playful. It wasn't something a person would do as a joke. It had a wrongness to it, a kind of deliberate, aware quality. Like whatever made that sound knew exactly where I was standing and wanted me to know it too. I didn't turn around. I didn't pause to think about what it could have been, didn't try to rationalize it as a pipe settling or an animal that had somehow gotten into the basement. My body just reacted before my brain had a chance to catch up. I bolted. I don't even remember covering the rest of that distance to the stairs. It's just a blur of motion in my memory, my hands slamming against the railing, my feet pounding up each step 2 at a time, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my ears. I didn't stop moving until I was standing in the kitchen with the basement door shut firmly behind me, breathing hard, staring at that closed door like it might fly open again at any second. I stood there in the kitchen for a long while after that, just trying to steady myself. Part of me wanted to immediately tell someone, to run and find my mom or call my dad and explain what had just happened. But another part of me, the more logical part, I guess, kept trying to talk me down, telling me I had probably just spooked myself in the dark, that sounds get distorted and strange in empty spaces, that my mind had filled in details that weren't really there, because I was already primed to be scared after realizing the light was out. I wanted so badly to believe that explanation. I still went over the rest of that evening carefully in my head, though, replaying the sound again and again, and each time I did, it sounded just as clear and just as wrong as it had the first time. There was nothing about it that felt like an accident of acoustics or an overactive imagination. It had a shape to it, a rhythm, the kind of thing an actual voice produces. not the kind of thing pipes or wind or an old furnace makes. I ended up not going back down into that basement again that night. The second load of laundry sat finished in the dryer, and I just left it there, telling myself I would grab it the next day when there was actual light to see by. I remember lying in bed that night with my door slightly open, listening to every small sound the house made, jumping at things that normally wouldn't have bothered me at all, a floorboard settling, the wind against the window, the refrigerator humming downstairs. None of it was the same as what I had heard in that basement, but my nerves were too worked up by then to fully relax anyway. My dad got home from work a bit later than usual that night, and the second I heard his car pull into the driveway, I felt this wave of relief wash over me, like everything would somehow be fixed, just because there was another adult in the house who wasn't scared of anything. I didn't tell him exactly what happened, not in full detail anyway. I just mentioned, as casually as I could manage, that the light in the basement had burned out and it would probably be a good idea to change it soon since it made the space really dark. He didn't think much of it, just nodded and said he'd take care of it, the way parents do with small household chores that don't seem urgent to them. A day or two later, he finally got around to it. I remember hovering near the top of the basement stairs while he went down to change the bulb, telling myself I was just curious, even though really I think part of me wanted to be close enough to hear if anything happened while he was down there. He flipped the light switch a few times to confirm the old bulb was really the problem, grabbed a replacement from the shelf in the laundry room, and swapped it out without any issue. I remember the exact moment the new bulb clicked on and light flooded back into that side of the basement. How much smaller and less threatening the whole space suddenly looked once you could actually see it clearly again. All those shapes that had felt so ominous and unknown in the dark turned back into what they actually were. An old dresser we didn't use anymore, some stacked plastic bins, a rolled-up rug leaning against the wall. My dad came back upstairs, mentioned offhand that the bulb had been more corroded than usual, like it had been in there a really long time, longer than he remembered it being, but didn't think much else of it. Just an old bulb finally giving out after years of use. Nothing unusual about that on its own. I went down later that same evening, once the light was working properly again, to finally grab that second load of laundry I had left sitting in the dryer. I walked through that same stretch of basement, the one where I had heard the cackle, fully lit this time, and it looked completely ordinary. No sign of anything out of place, nothing shifted or disturbed, nothing that would explain what I had heard a couple nights before. I have gone down into that basement plenty of times since then, always making sure to check that the light works before I fully commit to walking through, a habit I don't think I'll ever fully shake now. And in all that time, I have never heard that sound again, not once. No cackle, no strange laugh, nothing that comes even close to what I heard that night in the dark. Whatever it was seemed tied specifically to that one moment, that one stretch of darkness, like it only had a chance to reveal itself, because the usual light that kept the space normal and safe had failed. I still haven't told anyone else in the house the full story of what actually happened that night. My dad only knows the light burned out and needed replacing. My mom doesn't know anything happened at all beyond a bulb needing to be changed, which is such a mundane, forgettable kind of household task that she never asked a single follow-up question about it. Part of the reason I've kept it to myself is that I know exactly how it sounds when you try to explain it out loud. A cackling laugh in a dark basement, gone the second the lights came back on, never repeated since. It sounds like something a kid would make up to avoid doing chores, or something easily explained away by an overactive imagination working overtime in an unfamiliar dark space. I know that's probably what anyone I told would assume, and honestly, some days I try to convince myself of that same explanation, that it was just fear and darkness playing tricks on me, nothing more. But I remember that sound too clearly for that explanation to ever fully sit right with me. I remember exactly where it came from, directly behind me, close enough that I could have reached back and touched whatever made it if I had been brave enough to try. I remember the specific texture of it, that rough, aged, deliberate cackle that didn't sound like anything natural, didn't sound like anything that belonged in an ordinary basement under an ordinary house. Sounds like the wind or old pipes have a kind of randomness to them, an inconsistency you can usually explain if you think about it long enough. What I heard that night had none of that randomness. It had intention behind it, a wrongness that felt aimed directly at me. Every so often, usually when I'm down there doing laundry and everything is quiet except for the hum of the washer, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder toward that same stretch of the basement, half expecting to hear it again, half bracing myself just in case the light decides to go out one more time. It never has happened again, not in all the years since, but that hasn't made the memory of it any less vivid, and it hasn't made me any less careful about checking that light switch every single time before I make that walk across the room. Looking back on it now, I've had a lot of time to think about that house, and whether there were other small things over the years that may be connected to what happened that night, little details I brushed off at the time without really considering them. We had lived in that house for a few years already by the time the light burned out, and in all that time there had been a handful of odd, forgettable moments that I never gave much weight to on their own, but that started to feel different once I put them next to that cackle in the dark. There was a period, maybe a year or so before that night, where my mom kept complaining that things in the basement storage area seemed slightly moved around whenever she went down there. Nothing dramatic, just small things. A box shifted a few inches from where she remembered leaving it. A folding chair left open when she was sure she had left it closed. She always assumed it was one of us, my dad or me, going down there and forgetting to put things back the way we found them, and neither of us ever bothered to argue the point, because it genuinely seemed like such a minor, unimportant thing to bring up. Nobody in the house ever seriously considered it might be anything other than someone simply forgetting where they'd left something. There was also the furnace. Our furnace was old, original to the house as far as we knew, and it made all sorts of ordinary clunks and hums as it cycled on and off throughout the day, which was normal enough that none of us thought twice about it. But every once in a while, usually late at night, it would kick on with what my dad used to jokingly call its haunted house noise, a kind of long, low groan before settling into its usual hum. We all laughed about it as a family more than once, joking that the furnace sounded like it was complaining about being woken up. Nobody actually thought the house was haunted. It was just a funny thing to say about an old appliance that made strange noises sometimes. After that night in the basement, though, I found myself thinking back on that joke a lot differently. It didn't feel funny anymore, even though logically I knew a furnace groaning and a deliberate aged cackle right behind me were two very different things. I also remembered, a little while after the incident, a conversation I had with one of my school friends who had grown up not far from our house, in a neighborhood that had been built around the same time. She mentioned once, in that offhand way you bring up local gossip, that a few of the older houses on our side of town, including possibly ours, though she wasn't entirely sure, had been built on land that used to be part of a much older piece of property from decades earlier, something that had burned down long before either of our families moved into the area. She didn't know many details, just that her own grandmother had mentioned it once in passing, some story about an old house on that land that had a bit of a strange reputation locally, though nothing anyone ever seemed to take seriously enough to actually look into. At the time she told me this, I didn't think much of it, filed it away as just another piece of small-town rumor the kind every neighborhood seems to have if you ask around long enough. It was only much later, after everything with the basement, that the memory of that conversation came back to me and made me wonder if there was more truth buried in it than either of us realized at the time. None of these things individually would have made me think twice. A misplaced box, a groaning furnace, a vague rumor about old land, all things that on their own are easy enough to explain away without ever needing to consider anything unusual going on. But once I had that night in the dark basement to compare them to, once I had heard something that couldn't be explained by a settling pipe or an overactive imagination. All those smaller details started to feel like pieces of a pattern I had never bothered to notice before, scattered across years of living in that house without ever connecting them. I never brought any of it up with my parents, partly because I didn't think they would take it seriously, and partly because I wasn't sure I wanted to hear them dismiss it, the way adults often do with things they can't easily explain. It felt easier to just carry the memory privately, to keep doing my laundry on schedule, checking the light every time before crossing that stretch of the basement, and letting the rest of the family go about their lives without ever knowing there was a night when I heard something in the dark that I still can't fully explain. No matter how many times I've gone back over it in my head trying to find a reasonable answer. Sometimes, on the nights when I'm down there a little later than usual, when the house upstairs has gone quiet and everyone else has already gone to bed, I find myself moving a little faster through that open part of the basement than I probably need to, even with the light fully working and every corner of the room clearly visible. It's a small habit, one I don't think I'll ever fully lose. A leftover reflex from that one night when the light went out, and something that shouldn't have been there let me know, in the clearest way possible, that it was standing close enough to reach. There is one more small detail I still think about from time to time, something I didn't notice until weeks after the bulb had already been replaced. I was down doing laundry on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, folding a stack of towels on the table in the laundry room, when I happened to glance over at the shelf where my dad kept a small box of spare bulbs for around the house. Out of pure habit, I picked up the old bulb that had burned out that night, the one my dad had pulled from the fixture and left sitting there instead of throwing away right off the bat, the way he sometimes does with things he means to get rid of eventually, but never quite gets around to. I turned it over in my hand, half expecting it to just look like any other burned-out bulb, blackened a little at the base, nothing unusual. Instead, the inside of the glass was coated in this fine, dark residue, almost like soot, spread unevenly across the inner surface in a pattern that didn't look like it came from simple electrical burnout. I'm not an electrician, and I have no real way of knowing what a normal blown bulb is supposed to look like on the inside compared to whatever this was, so maybe there's a perfectly boring explanation for it that I just don't know enough to recognize. But, holding it there in my hand, turning it slowly under the laundry room light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about it looked wrong in a way I didn't have the knowledge to properly explain. The same uneasy feeling I'd had standing in the dark a few weeks earlier, just quieter this time, and easier to set back down on the shelf and walk away from without asking any further questions. I never mentioned that bulb to anyone either. I just set it back exactly where I found it, finished folding the towels, and went back upstairs like nothing had happened at all, the same way I've handled every other small piece of that night since. Some things, I've decided, are easier to live with quietly than to try and explain out loud to people who weren't standing in that basement with me when the lights went out. It stays with me anyway, tucked in the back of my mind every single time I carry a hamper down those stairs. A small private reminder that not everything in that house ever got a real explanation, and probably never will. When I was a kid, there was one single household chore that I dreaded more than absolutely anything else. And it wasn't cleaning my room or taking out the trash or any of the usual things kids complain about. It was carrying my dirty clothes down to the basement and placing them in a big pile next to the washing machine so my mom could do the wash later. That might sound like such a small, insignificant task to most people. Nothing that should have bothered a child so deeply, but for me it was one of the most terrifying parts of my entire week, every single time, without fail. Our basement was split in a way that made it feel even more unsettling than a normal basement might have. Part of it had been finished at some point, carpeted, drywalled, set up almost like an extra living space, but the other side, the side where the washer and dryer sat, had never been touched. It was just bare concrete floor, exposed wooden beams overhead, unfinished walls with insulation showing through in places, cobwebs gathering in the corners no one ever bothered to clean because nobody wanted to spend more time down there than they absolutely had to. That unfinished half of the basement is the part I hated. It felt like a completely different space from the rest of the house, colder somehow, both in temperature and in the way it made me feel the moment I stepped into it. I had nightmares about that basement, more than I've ever had nightmares about anything else in my entire life, before or since. Not just the occasional bad dream that fades within a few hours of waking up, but genuine, recurring nightmares, the kind where you start to recognize the pattern even while you're still trapped inside it, and recognizing it doesn't help you escape any faster. If anything, knowing what was coming made it worse, because I would feel that familiar dread creeping in at the start of the dream and know exactly what direction things were about to go, powerless to change any of it. One version of the nightmare played out like this. I would be home alone in the dream, wandering through the house doing something completely ordinary, and then, without any clear trigger, I would suddenly become aware that something was approaching. I never had a name for it in the dream, never had a clock or a clear signal telling me the moment had arrived. But I could feel it settling into my bones the way you feel a storm coming before you ever see the clouds. Something bad was about to happen, and there was no reasoning behind it. Just this absolute, bone-deep certainty. So in the dream, I would rush to the kitchen and crawl underneath the kitchen table, tucking myself into the smallest space I could manage, because the door to the basement was right there in the kitchen, just a few feet from that table, and some instinct always told me that was the only place I had any chance of being safe. Then, every single time, the basement door would creak open. I never saw a full figure, never saw a face, only a pair of legs stepping through that doorway into the kitchen, moving slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever it was had all the time in the world and no reason to hurry. I never learned who this man was supposed to be. I never got a clear look at anything above the knees. But I always knew, with the same absolute certainty that had sent me under the table in the first place, that if this thing caught me out in the open, it would do something to me that I would not survive. Or worse, something I would survive but wish I hadn't. The worst part of that particular nightmare wasn't even the fear of being caught. It was the creeping realization, every single time the dream played out, that it already knew exactly where I was. It knew I was under that table. It could see me, or sense me, or simply understood, on some level beyond sight, that a small, terrified child was folded up beneath the kitchen table, trying desperately not to make a sound. And it didn't rush toward me. It didn't yank the tablecloth back and grab me right away. It just stood there in the kitchen, close enough that I could see those legs from my hiding spot, taking its time, savoring the fact that I was so afraid, enjoying the process of my hiding just as much as it would have enjoyed the process of catching me. That feeling of being both hidden and completely exposed at the same time of knowing that my hiding spot meant absolutely nothing to something that already knew exactly where I was, is a feeling I have never fully been able to shake, even decades removed from being that scared little kid under the table. There was another version of the nightmare, sometimes standing completely on its own, and sometimes tacked on to the end of a totally unrelated dream, almost like my subconscious couldn't resist working the basement back in no matter what else was happening. In this one, I would be walking down the basement stairs, an ordinary descent at first. Nothing unusual about it, but I always knew, with that same dream logic certainty, exactly what was waiting for me at the bottom. The moment my foot touched that final step, everything around me would be plunged into complete darkness, as if someone had thrown a switch and erased the entire basement from existence. And in that same instant, something would grab me. I have never been able to properly put into words the specific flavor of terror that moment produced in me. Dream after dream, night after night. It wasn't just fear of the dark or fear of being grabbed. It was the horrible, helpless knowledge, standing at the very top of those stairs before I had even taken my first step down, of exactly what was going to happen at the bottom, combined with the complete inability to stop my own legs from carrying me down there anyway. I would think, even within the dream, don't go down there, you know what happens, turn around right now. And my body would simply keep walking, one step after another, carrying me steadily toward an ending I already knew by heart and could do absolutely nothing to prevent. There were other nightmares too, smaller variations, different setups, but always circling back to that same basement, that same unfinished side of it with the washer and dryer, always ending somewhere between dread and outright terror. In one version, I would be searching for something down there, some object I desperately needed to find, digging through boxes that seemed to multiply the longer I looked, and the whole time I would feel eyes on the back of my neck, certain that turning around would show me something I could never unsee. In another, I would already be standing at the washing machine, going about the ordinary business of loading clothes in, when the machine itself would begin to hum a low, wrong note that didn't belong to any washer I had ever heard, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than the machine itself. I don't think there was a single month during those years of my childhood where I didn't have at least one dream that involved that space in some way. By the time I was old enough to really reflect on it, I had come to genuinely hate that basement in a way that went far beyond typical childhood spookiness about dark rooms. It felt personal, like that specific space, and I had some kind of ongoing relationship built entirely out of fear. I remember describing some of these dreams to a friend at school once, expecting maybe a laugh or a shrug, the kind of casual dismissal kids usually give each other's scary stories. Instead, she got quiet for a moment and told me her own basement gave her a strange feeling too, though she couldn't explain exactly why, and that she avoided going down there alone whenever she could help it. Hearing that made me feel less alone in it, but it also planted a small seed of doubt in my mind, a wondering if maybe there really was something about basements in general, something about being below ground level in an unfinished, half-forgotten part of a house that our young minds were somehow more attuned to than we understood. I never came to any real conclusion about it, just filed the thought away the way kids do with most things too big for them to fully work through, and went right on dreading my own basement, regardless of whether hers felt the same way or not. Because of all this, doing laundry, or rather, carrying my laundry down to leave in that pile for my mom, became this small, daily gauntlet I had to force myself through. I would put it off as long as possible, sometimes wearing the same shirt an extra day just to avoid that walk down the stairs, until eventually the pile in my room got large enough, or my mom asked pointedly enough, that I had no more excuses left. even during the daytime, even with the sun fully up outside and every rational part of my brain insisting there was nothing down there but a washer, a dryer, and some old boxes. I could never fully convince the rest of me that the basement was actually safe. One particular day, I found myself home alone, which on its own already made the idea of going down to the basement feel worse than usual. Normally, I had at least the comfort of knowing someone else was upstairs, within shouting distance, even if they weren't standing right next to me. But this time, it was just me in the house, aside from my dog, who had been curled up somewhere nearby the way she usually was on quiet afternoons. I knew I needed to take my laundry down. I had been putting it off for a couple of days already, and I didn't want to deal with my mom asking again why the pile in my room kept growing instead of shrinking. I remember standing at the top of the basement stairs for a moment, working up the nerve, before deciding that having my dog with me would make the whole thing feel less unbearable. She was a good-sized dog, alert, always eager to follow me wherever I went, and something about having her there, even if she couldn't actually do anything against whatever imaginary threat lived in that basement in my head, made the idea of going down there feel slightly more survivable. So I gathered up my laundry into my arms, whistled for her, and headed down the stairs together, her claws clicking against the wood ahead of and behind me the whole way down. It was the middle of the day, and the light coming through those small slit windows near the top of the unfinished basement walls was doing its best to fill the space with a kind of pale, dusty daylight. It wasn't bright by any means. Those windows were small and set high up, more like narrow slots than proper windows, but it was enough to chase away the total blackness that haunted my dreams. With actual light filtering in, and my dog trotting along beside me, sniffing at boxes and corners with her usual carefree curiosity, the basement honestly didn't feel all that terrifying in that moment. I remember feeling almost proud of myself, this small flicker of bravery, like maybe I was finally starting to grow out of being scared of a room in my own house. I walked over to the washing machine with a kind of casual confidence I didn't normally allow myself down there, tossed my armful of clothes onto the growing pile beside it, and turned to head back toward the stairs. Even with all that daytime boldness, some old habits still kicked in the second I turned around. I always ran up those basement stairs every single time, regardless of how brave I felt walking down them. It was just automatic at that point, an instinct built from years of nightmares, and I wasn't about to break that pattern just because the sun happened to be shining outside. I was a skinny, scrawny kid at that age, light on my feet. The kind of kid whose footsteps barely made a sound even when I was trying to be loud. So as I started my usual dash up the stairs, my own feet barely tapped against the wood. Quick and quiet. Nothing that should have echoed or carried very far at all. And then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A sudden, chaotic burst of thudding and scrambling, loud and frantic, coming up the stairs directly behind me. My brain did not process that sound the way it might process an ordinary noise. It didn't pause to consider possibilities, didn't run through a mental checklist of what could reasonably be making that kind of racket. Every single nightmare I had ever had about that basement, every version of that thing grabbing me at the bottom of the stairs, every memory of those unknown legs stepping through the kitchen doorway, all of it slammed into my conscious mind at once, and for a moment my brain simply shut down under the weight of it. This was it. This was the moment. Whatever had been chasing me through my dreams for years had finally decided the dream wasn't enough anymore, and it was coming for me in real life, right there on those same basement stairs. I screamed, a full, raw, terrified scream that tore out of me before I had even fully processed what was happening. I felt my heart slamming against my ribs so hard it almost hurt. A physical pain layered right on top of the terror. My legs, which had been carrying me up those stairs just a second earlier, completely gave out on me. I couldn't keep moving, couldn't force myself to take even one more step toward the top. Instead, I just collapsed right there on the staircase, folding in on myself, curling into as tight a ball as I could manage, exactly the same instinct that had always sent me scrambling under that kitchen table in my dreams. Except this time, there was no table to hide under. Just the hard edge of a wooden stair digging into my side, and the sound of something coming up fast behind me. I think anyone who grew up being told, over and over, that monsters aren't real, that there's nothing to be afraid of in the dark, that nightmares are just nightmares and can't follow you into the waking world, can maybe understand just a fraction of what that moment felt like. Every reassurance I had ever been given suddenly meant absolutely nothing. Because, in that instant, curled up on those stairs, I was completely convinced that everything I had ever been told was wrong, that the thing from my nightmares was real after all, and it had finally caught up to me in my own home, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, with sunlight still streaming through those little basement windows behind me. I squeezed my eyes shut as tightly as I possibly could, bracing myself, waiting for whatever was about to happen, absolutely certain in that moment that I was about to die right there on the stairs. I don't know exactly how long I stayed like that, curled up with my eyes shut, waiting for something to grab me the way it always had in my dreams. It felt like an eternity, though realistically it was probably only a second or two, my whole sense of time completely warped by the terror flooding through me. Nothing grabbed me. No hand closed around my ankle, no cold grip pulled me backward into darkness. Instead, I felt something warm and heavy shove hard against my curled-up body, pushing past me on the narrow staircase, and a wet nose pressed briefly against the side of my face. It was my dog. She had apparently gotten distracted, sniffing around near the washing machine while I made my way toward the stairs, and once she realized I was leaving without her, she had bolted after me at full speed, her claws scrabbling wildly against the wood in her rush to catch up, which was exactly the chaotic thudding and scrambling sound I had heard behind me. In her excitement to reach me, she had barreled straight into the back of my legs right as I collapsed onto the stairs, and now she was standing over me, tail wagging, completely confused about why I was curled up in a ball making noises she had probably never heard me make before. It took several long moments for my brain to catch up with what my eyes and my hands, now reaching out to feel her familiar fur, were telling me. It was her. It had only ever been her. There was no man with unseen legs, no creature from the bottom of the stairs, nothing waiting in the dark to grab me. Just my own dog, excited and a little clumsy, chasing after the person she loved most because she didn't want to be left behind in a basement by herself. I remember laughing, this shaky, half-hysterical laugh that came out somewhere between relief and leftover terror, still shaking all over, my heart taking a long while to slow back down to something resembling normal. I sat there on the stairs for a good while longer after that, my dog now pressed up against my side, letting me hug onto her while my breathing gradually evened out. I didn't tell my mom what had happened when she got home later that day. I didn't tell anyone, actually, not for a long time. It felt embarrassing, admitting that my own dog running up the stairs behind me had triggered such an intense, complete panic response. The kind that left me curled up sobbing and convinced I was about to die. I worried people would laugh, or worse, that they would use it as proof that all my basement fears had been silly all along. Nothing but an overactive imagination finally catching up with reality in the most anticlimactic way possible. But here's the thing I could never quite explain to anyone, even years later when I finally did start telling this story. The fact that it turned out to be my dog didn't actually make the fear I felt in that moment any less real. For those few seconds, curled up on that staircase with my eyes shut tight, I was completely, genuinely certain that the thing from my nightmares had followed me out of my sleep and into my waking life. My body reacted exactly the way it would have reacted to a real threat, exactly the way years of dreams had trained it to react to that specific sound, that specific staircase, that specific sense of something coming up behind me. Knowing afterward that it was just my dog didn't erase the fact that in that instant my entire nervous system had been absolutely convinced I was about to die. I never had that exact dream again after that day, the one with the darkness swallowing the bottom of the stairs, but the other one, the one with the legs stepping through the kitchen doorway while I hid under the table, kept coming back for years afterward, on and off, less frequently as I got older, but never fully disappearing. I still don't know what that was supposed to be, why my child brain latched onto that specific image and repeated it so many times, or why the unfinished side of that basement in particular became such a fixed point of terror for me when so many other kids I knew barely gave their own basements a second thought. What I do know is that even now, as an adult, long after moving out of that house and leaving behind that particular basement for good, I still feel a small flicker of that old unease whenever I have to walk down an unfamiliar set of basement stairs, especially ones that are dimly lit, especially ones where I can't quite see all the way to the bottom before I start my descent. It's not the same overwhelming terror it used to be. I don't collapse into a ball anymore, and I don't lay awake dreading laundry day the way I did as a kid. But that small flicker never fully went away either. This quiet reminder tucked somewhere in the back of my mind that some fears, even the ones you eventually explain away with something as ordinary as an excited dog, leave a mark that doesn't ever completely fade. Years later, long after I had moved out on my own, I brought the story up with my mom during a random conversation about our old house, half expecting her to laugh it off the way I had always assumed she would. Instead, she went quiet for a moment, the same way my old friend had all those years earlier, and admitted that she had never much liked that side of the basement either. Even as a grown adult who supposedly had no reason left to be scared of dark rooms. She told me she used to rush through loading the washer herself sometimes, especially in the evenings, without ever really examining why, just following some instinct that told her not to linger down there longer than necessary. Hearing her say that surprised me more than I expected it to. Some small part of me had always assumed my fear was just a child's imagination running wild, something I would have grown out of eventually if I had simply been braver about the whole thing. Learning that my own mother, a grown woman with no history of nightmares about the place as far as I knew, felt some version of that same unease made me wonder all over again whether there had been something genuinely off about that space the whole time. Something beyond an overactive childhood imagination working overtime on an unfinished basement and a handful of bad dreams. We ended up talking for a while that evening about the house in general, trading small memories back and forth, some ordinary and some a little stranger than I remembered at the time. She mentioned the house had been built decades before we ever moved in, and that she had never bothered looking too deeply into its history when they bought it, focused more on the price and the size of the yard than anything else. Neither of us ever went looking for answers after that conversation. Some part of me didn't want to know, worried that whatever I might find would only confirm something I had spent years trying to convince myself was nothing more than childhood imagination. So I let it stay exactly what it had always been to me, a stretch of unfinished concrete and old boxes that happened to live rent-free in my nightmares for years, A place that once made me curl up on the stairs, certain I was about to die, only to look up and find nothing more than my own dog standing over me, tail wagging, utterly confused about why the person she loved most was suddenly so afraid. Even now, that memory sits somewhere between funny and unsettling whenever I think back on it. A strange little scar left over from childhood that never quite finished healing, no matter how many years pass or how many ordinary basements I walk through without anything ever happening again.